Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the Kill Stream. I am your host, Ethan Ralph, the owner and the editor-in-chief of the RalphRetort.com. There I am. There's the three view. Here comes the double view. They're already talking. You can't hear him just yet. There's logo. Let me switch over. So usually we have the special layout with the debate and me in the middle, but there's four people, so I didn't really think that would, I didn't know if that would work right. So we're going to switch between the three view and the double view here. All right, now let me unmute the tab. Logo's coughing like I just was a minute ago right before we came on air. All right, now.
Corona, I'm not sure, though.
All right, now we can hear you. Hopefully it's not Corona. Speaking of Corona, Biden gave his speech earlier. We covered that at the end of Tequila Sunrise. If you want to check that out, it'll be on killstream.tv later. Okay, you know what? Let's just jump right into it. I know everybody's got their own scheduling and stuff like that, so... Logo, you were talking. We're going to do 5-minute introductions here. I dubbed it as the fascism debate, although it's a little, more
oh, so am I up? Am I talking
Yeah, I
now?
figured why not?
I have the floor?
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I'm pretty sure that what the debate's supposed to be about, I think there were two subjects. The first one would be whether or not we would define China under Xi Jinping as fascist. I don't think that really makes sense as a discussion topic because it's going to come down to just fucking arbitrary definition games. And for me to go with the Communist Party calls itself communist, it is communist. It's called itself communist for almost 100 years. It's the oldest communist party that's still in existence and governs the state. I don't see any reason not to call them what they call themselves. It seems pretty simple to me. And I think it's justifiable in all ways. The other one was regarding whether or not capitalists funded fascists during World War II or their movement leading up to it. I think capitalists personally funded pretty much all sides because capitalists tend to hedge their bets. So they invest in pretty much everything. I mean, this is something Donald Trump would say, right? Where he's if you're a capitalist, you fund all political parties because you're going to need all of them at some point. So I don't really see that also as that interesting of a debate, considering the communists were also funded by some capitalists at some times, and it all goes down to minutia. So I'm more interested in having a discussion with these guys because I think that we have similar ways of looking at things in some respects, but we have some other disagreements, which we'll probably get into. I think we could have a productive discussion. I don't really know debates. Debates seem to me kind of spectacle and a farce, and they don't seem to produce much of value. So that's my opening statement, I guess.
All right, well, we'll just stick with your side, and then we'll go to the other. Go ahead, Infraheads, you've never been on the show. Logo actually has been on the show a while back. Why don't you go ahead and put your side out there?
I'm Haas. I'm from the Infrared Collective. We run the Infrared YouTube channel, and we're on Twitch at twitch.tv/Infrared Show. We call ourselves a platform for Marxism-Leninism in the age of multipolarity and the post-COVID world. And so specifically as it concerns this debate, I think the way I want to approach this is pretty much from two levels. One, I think the discussion or the debate about the character of China has to rest upon a specific assumption about the relationship between content and form and appearance and essence. Now, Marxism itself, having grounded itself in a specific ontology or metaphysics of the materialist dialectic, recognizes there's a contradiction between content and form. There is no fixed doctrine that premises the development of reality. And Marxism is just an index of the recognition of this fact. If we assume that content and form are one and the same, then as a matter of fact, we would have to concede that there's no possible way we could call China, which is governed by a communist party, governed by people, ruled by people who call themselves Marxists and communists, and who describe the system in which they live as communist. This is the form. We cannot say the essence of this form is fascist, because this would imply there's a contradiction between appearance and essence. But that same very contradiction is the object of Marxism itself. And on the other hand, if we are also not permitted to describe fascism beyond what fascist intellectuals have described of their own theory and ideas and so-called doctrine, then it doesn't make sense that we would assume there's a deeper essence to Chinese Marxism beyond what's already on the surface. So I detect a contradiction in these two facets of the debate between whether fascism was in fact liberalism in crisis and in an emergency mode, which obviously contradicts what fascist intellectuals themselves said about it. And on the other hand, the question of whether China is fascist, despite Chinese Marxists and intellectuals never describing, well, the overwhelming majority of Chinese intellectuals at least, never describing their own system and their own country as fascist. So to me, I think the debate will have to revolve around developing and addressing this specific contradiction between form and content.
All right, Mr. Woods, Keith Woods, go ahead. Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I'm not sure about that line of argument. I'm interested to hear where Haz goes with that, but I think we can look at the history of fascism. We can look at what fascist theorists believed and how they governed, and we can single out fascism as a class of developmental nationalism with specific characteristics. And I think when we look at China, I don't think it's good enough to say that the CCP still identifies as communist, that they still consider themselves to be carrying on a lineage that includes Marx and Lenin and Mao and so on. I mean, the United States claims to be the ultimate bastion of freedom and liberty, but I don't think anyone here is going to agree with that exactly. I think it's important in terms of where we're going. I mean, everyone on this, I think we have large agreements in terms of the direction of things. I mean, I saw Haz the other day was kind of defending a kind of national populist position that I wouldn't really disagree with so much. But I think the Marxist baggage kind of hinders things. And I don't think it's a good model to explain China's success or to map onto other countries that are attempting to kind of navigate this sort of post-colonial direction that I think Haz thinks we're going in. As far as fascists being funded by capitalists, I mean, you can say, yeah, every side is funded by capitalists, but the historical record is quite clear on this. I mean, there's some books that amount to conspiracy theories like Conjuring Hitler that try and piece together stuff that isn't there. But if you look at the really respected historians in this, like Henry Ashby Turner, there's wide-ranging agreement that the fascist movements were largely funded by small business owners, the unemployed, people in rural areas. There was no real big business support to speak of. There was a couple of industrialists that briefly supported Hitler. We can get into that later. One of them was later put in Dachau concentration camp. And really, I think they're going to repeat a lot of Marxist mythology about fascism that came out of the communist Comintern in the 20s and 30s, where communists were rushing to explain what was going on with their preconceived notions, but most of these theories didn't look at empirical facts at all. So yeah, I'll pass it over to Joel.
Go ahead, Joel. Joel Davis, by the way, first time on the show as well. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so from what I said before about, we can't tell Marxists what Marxism is, because if we say that, Marxists can't tell fascists what fascism is, I feel like this is BS. Like this is the truth. And that's just ideological nonsense. Like the truth is the truth. Someone's got to be right. I mean, maybe both are wrong, but we can't both be right because they're totally incompatible positions. So that's why this needs to be a debate. Anyway, so I think there's probably no notion more integral to Marxist thought than the assertion that, material historical analysis is kind of integral to theorizing the political, right? So like for Marx, this means that the mode of production by which humanity generates the means of its own survival is the basis of all social and political structure. And I think this is correct, like when stated like this. But I think Marxism's fundamental flaw is its reduction of the production of the means of life to its economic aspect. And as a consequence, it reduces the social and the political to the economic. And I think if you reject this reduction, you have to kind of reject the Marxist theoretical reduction of the state to the role of a mere enforcer of class domination in response to antagonism between economic classes. And this ruptures like the entire theory of Marxism. You can't patch it together once you make that call. So it's a big question. The concrete material historical reality of politics and economics, yes, obviously economics plays a role, but it also takes place within geography, and the institutional capacity of political orders to secure themselves against internal and external enemies is an organizational question which transcends mere economic factors and is also material historical. And these conditions forced both the Bolsheviks and the CCP to take actions which violated, in my view, their Marxist-Leninist ideological priors, and we can get into that a bit later. But when we look at like the Russian and Chinese revolutions themselves, we can see in both cases that the revolutions only occurred because they seized opportunities that were induced by politically destabilizing conflicts between dominant economic and political classes. In both cases, you have the landed gentry and the monarchies respectively. And this conflict was both cases a result of not of economic antagonism, but the geopolitical pressure that inducing a kind of political antagonism between organizational requirements of the state's internal and external security, impacting the interests of the dominant economic class. And this provoked the gentry in both cases to support challenging and deposing the Romanov and Manchu dynasties respectively. And this in turn created power vacuums, which the Bolsheviks and CCP respectively capitalized upon. Now, class obviously played a role in these revolutions. There's obviously, like, I'm not negating class completely, but they are complex historical events that are irreducible to the mere economic dynamics of class. And we see direct evidence for this with states like Japan or Prussia, which transitioned from feudalism to industrial capitalism without requisite social revolutions, nuking their monarchies and communist parties taking over. So there's contingency in history that needs to be explained. And I bring all this up because the first point of my argument is that China might be ideologically Marxist, but it's not materially historically Marxist, I would argue. And in fact, nothing is, because Marxism fails to accurately theorize material history. And the assertion that it is Marxist is pure abstraction, pure ideology. It has no relation to concrete reality. And that kind of betrays the Marxist project fundamentally, and the material historical reality of the contemporary Chinese state, however, I think bears far closer resemblance to fascism or National Socialism. And this is precisely because both these ideologies rejected Marxism's economic reductionism in favor of a geopolitical conception of the state's responsibilities, which justify the very state-led, pragmatic, developmentalist economic model that we see in contemporary China, as well as the CCP's promotion of nationalist socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, China is so successful, in my view, precisely because Marx was wrong about the state. States aren't reducible to class antagonism, and this is why states like China and Hitler's Germany could subordinate the economic sphere to a national idea and politically administer collaboration between economic classes. And we see this contradiction of Marx expressed in contemporary CCP ideology with doctrines like the Three Represents, which is an emulation of Mussolini's heretical rejection of the Marxist doctrine of class struggle. And so when Marxists proclaim that China isn't real Marxism, I think they're right, because there is no real Marxism in practice. It's simply impossible to practice a theory which is so fundamentally flawed. But real National Socialism has been tried, and it's the most effective political system modernity has ever produced. And this is why the CCP are the most successful government on the planet right now, in my view. So yeah, I'll start with that.
All right, now I'm going to let you guys just get right into it. Now, one of the features of the Killstream debates is the questioning of each other, and especially on a topic like this, not my forte necessarily, although I know a little bit about it a little bit. But you guys were already into this subject, basically arguing amongst yourselves. I brought it to the Killstream, so I see no reason to kind of stop that. And I'll just go ahead and start with Keith. If you have any like debate points you want to start with here, or like critiques of the other side's position that you would like to like kind of begin the program with, or Joel, y'all side, it's kind of a tag team affair.
Well, I'd just start with maybe getting some agreement on definitions, and I guess I'd ask Infrared or Logo what their definition of socialism is, because I think this is going to come up a lot later on when they try to say that fascism was a form of capitalism.
Well, the way I see it is there isn't a country in the world that isn't socialist right now. Like socialism, sort of like a word like democracy, where pretty much every single, well, I don't know, are there any states that don't justify themselves on a democratic line of some sort at this point? I think socialism was like the result of, like, fundamentally it was like a global revolution that happened at the end of the 19th century. And I think, like, America's been a socialist country for just as long as everywhere else. So I think that socialism is just like the state of things as they are now.
I think we actually, the Infrared Collective, we produced a number of videos on the question of the essence of socialism. And the basic idea is that socialism must be understood and defined within the context of the loss of sociality, this common object that is the object of common civilization, statehood, culture, and so on and so on. Some common sociality, which in basically the history following from then. And then we can trace, for example, the modern financial institutions and so on that really are kind of the heart of 21st century capitalism, or whatever survives of it. You can actually trace their lineage back to this historical period. So I think when we say, for example, I've put up forward this idea too, that, we can also say America is socialist. One has to think dialectically. We're not necessarily saying that capitalism has completely been eliminated and capitalism is gone, but that capitalism has kind of reduced its real basis to the kind of vestigial, institutional, and superstructural form of already essentially socialistic mode of production.
Yeah, I mean, like, the thing is that, like, our modern financial system was created by socialists. Like, if we're talking about, like, hedge funds managing people's pensions and shit like that, like basically how everything works in America, that was developed by socialists as like a way of restraining. Like, capitalists were basically like, they were like destroying people's pension funds and things like this. This was causing like major economic crashes and shit throughout the 20th century. So like the development of like the Bretton Woods system and all that stuff, this is all done by people who called themselves socialists. I mean, Carnegie,
yeah, sure, but I mean,
these guys all called themselves socialists. So like,
yeah, sure, but I mean, there is some sense,
socialism.
there is some sense in which we can say China is socialist in a way that the US isn't, and the US is a capitalist country. I mean, I think,
agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard a definition from Has
sure.
before that I'd agree with, where I think Has said that socialism is the mode of production directed toward a social end. That's maybe a little bit ambiguous, but I think we can agree that.
It still seems so tautological to me, though. It's like, socialism is so. Yeah, like, what do you mean? Like, it's like the definition is so broad, it's like meaningless.
Well, the thing is that I think that like the use of a definition, right, is like how much it brings like coherence or clarity to the world. So when I say something like every state in the world right now is socialist, I think that does actually like transfer some meaningful information, and it does lay a groundwork for how we understand
to be clear,
because communism would be the overcoming of socialism.
The thing, right? I have made many arguments before about the limitations of definitions and the Anglo box and so on. So I have made a simple definition of socialism. If you're not satisfied with the definition, just ask for clarification and I can elaborate.
I'm kind of interested in, do you consider China to be communist, or is it like, because I mean, from what I can tell, like the CCP seems to say, well, no, we're a socialist country. We're on our way to communism. It might take 100 years. And like, how would you define communism? How do we know when it's here? Because do you take Marx's definition, or do you disagree with Marx?
I can answer this question. So there's two senses of the word communism that are used by communist parties. One is a society that has already been set, as Marx put it, on its basis of a communistic mode of production. A society so thoroughly transformed by the process of communism that it is it is a mode of production entirely distinct from the old one. It doesn't have the kind of birthmarks of the old mode of production, so to speak. And then in the other sense is communism as a world historical force, which is actually how Marx described it. Marx said, by communism, we do not mean an ideal with society will have to conform itself to, but the real movement which sublates the present state of things. So in the sense of that Marx put it as the real movement, yes, China is communist, but in the sense of how Chinese Marxists conceive of, the different stages of socialism and a communist mode of production, a society so thoroughly transformed by this process that, for example, money has become eliminated. The kind of principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their need prevails. Superabundance, the advanced development of the forces of production to the point of the complete elimination of want and so on and so on. That is
it's like Star Trek.
I really hate that example. I think
because what I don't get, because like from reading Marx, he seems it's like obviously Marx develops his thought a lot throughout his career, but he has this concept of species being, this idea that like within us we have this natural proclivity to do whatever the fuck we want. I want to play guitar. I want to go build a house. I want to fish. I want to read a book. And then capitalism forces us to do some like repetitive process, like if we're like some proletarian, it's like proletarian in a factory.
To clarify,
this alienates us from our kind of inherent, our inherent nature to kind of actualize ourselves in the world. And the goal of communism would be ultimately this kind of almost like utopic notion, it seems like, of self-actualization. It's what you get from Marx's early writing, at least, when he's talking about his critique of alienation.
There's just really quick, two important things I want to clarify. Actually, it's Marx's humanism, species being, that we derive the unique Marxist view of socialism. So when we say mode of production for social ends, these social ends are the determinate form of humanity so far as the socialistic country or society is concerned. It's the specific type of human being whose needs and wants must be addressed at some kind of collective level, whose baseline standard of living and dignity and sense of ownership and stake in the economy and so on. And then the second thing regarding this, what you're talking about is Marx's description of the division of labor. So Marx's point is not that as human beings we have the proclivity to be whimsical about the different things we do, that as if like our different mode of activity in life is not rational. It's just completely based on arbitrary individual whim. And then from this misinterpretation, you get tendencies like Falk, fully automated luxury communism. Communism means no one works, we just do what we want and so on. But Marx's point is not so much about doing whatever we want, as so much as it is about the way in which the division of labor interpolates us and forces us to be one. For example, Marx says, I can fish in the afternoon. I don't forget what he specifically says, work in the evening and then write in the morning or something, without, and this is the important part, without ever becoming a fisherman, a writer, or a craftsman. So Marx's point is not the freedom to just do whatever you want whimsically, but human activity developing in a way that is in accordance with the inherent and latent abilities of human beings, which of course will differ across different people, different individuals, and so on and so on. But Marx's underlying point is about the division of labor. It's about the way labor is given a fixed form. The form of labor becomes fixed and is no longer allowed to develop as human labor as such, if that makes sense.
I don't know. It just seems like it seems kind of retarded to me, because I mean, and this gets to what I was saying in my original statement about, the material historical reality of geopolitics, the material historical reality of institutions and organization in the political, and this idea that economic relations is the driving force behind history. It just seems like a BS to me. If you take the example of the Soviet Union, and you look at the Russian Revolution, you look at Lenin in State and Revolution. He's talking about we're going to abolish bureaucratized militaries. We're going to have this. The workers are going to run the factories. They're going to have their own arms. We're not going to. And then but then the reality check. And I think Lenin believes this. Chomsky says Lenin's bullshitting to get in power, and then he really had this nefarious plan. I think he actually believed this stuff. Well, when they actually take power, then the cold hard reality of what it means to run a state actually comes upon them. And then when this happens, they have to go to what they called war communism, so to speak, where, okay, we've got to bureaucratize everything, create this giant red army with millions and millions of people, some of which they literally forced peasants into the army to fight the counter-revolution. And then, then after they win they put down the counter-revolution, they go, okay, we can take the boot off the neck a little bit of the peasants and the working class now, and we can have, the new economic policy or whatever, and things start kind of normalizing. Lenin dies, Stalin comes to power, and they go, well, wait a second, we got our ass handed to us in the First World War. If we don't sort our shit out, the next time we go to war with
we should rein it in a little bit, because this is going in many, many different branches.
No, just let me finish my point, because I'm going to land, and then I want to hear what you're going to say. So Stalin comes to power, and he's faced with a choice. That's an incredibly difficult choice, which is, I can either abuse the fuck out of my population, but maybe when we go to war with Germany or Japan or whatever, we win. Or I can not abuse my population, and then when we go to war, we can get our ass handed to us. And Stalin takes the decision, and I don't envy Stalin. He takes the decision, okay, I'm going to abuse the fuck out of my population. I'm going to go collectivize the peasants' farms. I'm going to force them into brutal working conditions. I'm going to militarize the production, and then we're going to do this crazy industrialization process. And you know what? It worked. They fucking beat the Nazis, right? But the cost, how many people went to gulags? How many people got shot? Like millions of people died in order to sacrifice to get that done. And this, to me, is reality. This fanciful BS in Marx about communism, this is just nonsense. And when you say that China is communist, I don't see it. I see China as a very competent state. But I don't.
Yeah, the issue here though is that we have made a lot of particular concrete assumptions on the basis of a very, very broad and I may say very reckless kind of view of the history you just described. So point by point, I'll try to just address what you said based on what I remembered. The first thing I remember you saying before you said the thing about war communism, what did you say first initially? That you think it's
I was talking about Lenin's State and Revolution. Where
okay. So that's where you began. Yeah. Lenin's State and Revolution may have the actual folding of history may have, I guess, made his expectations more realistic, but the way you've described it is just blatantly not true. So the expectation of very intellectuals and artistic classes and cultural classes that, oh yes, we're going to have the revolution, we're going to be very generous about abolishing higher. Well, I think most Bolsheviks at the time would consider this a kind of ultra left deviation. It's kind of a dizziness of the success of the revolution. The fact of the matter is that the Bolsheviks, I mean, you have to understand the people you're talking about. These were hardened people who understood the cold, sobering realities of life more than anyone else at their time. They were in Siberian camps. They were professional revolutionaries. So these are not soft snowflakes who are just, faced with harsh, cruel realities. People, the leading Bolsheviks, people like Lenin, always understood these realities to be harsh from the very beginning. So war communism was not some drastic. Lenin understood that the proletarian dictatorship was the dictatorship of one class against another. This is before he seized power. They had no delusional expectations that they were going to seize power and immediately create a nice communist society. And I think you've misinterpreted the meaning of Marx's words here. You've made a lot of assumptions about, like the process Marx is describing to arrive at this fund that would arrive, not to. It's a very important distinction, that would arrive.
I don't think I'm misunderstanding anything. I mean, you haven't explained to me how.
Well,
you haven't responded. You haven't responded to my critique of economic reductionism, for one.
Okay, that was the first thing you said. I'll get there. I just want to talk again about the Stalin thing you mentioned. You said Stalin was going to treat his own population like shit. Although the collectivization resulted in a catastrophic famine, as all forms of the modernization of agriculture across the entire history of humanity have, and compared to those, the ones that happened in Europe and the human costs of European modernization, all of the deaths combined of China and the Soviet Union are extremely modest in terms of their brutality and violence and so on and so on. So I don't think we should bring this up and repeat these kind of black legends when it has no explanatory value. The fact of the matter is that the path Stalin pursued of socialism in one country and the industrialization, first of all, was not based on the militarization of agriculture. This was Trotsky's plan for super industrialization. Stalin's plan it wasn't his specific plan, but the promotion of the collective farm as a model for the industrialization of the economy so that agriculture can finally support the industrialization of the Soviet Union. This was not the militarization. The collective farms had a good degree of autonomy compared to the top-down state sovkhozes and the institutions that were directly controlled by the state. So this is just patently not true. Now, the question of economic reductionism is also a misunderstanding. You are assuming that Marxism is a kind of metaphysics in which we explain the world before us in terms of some kind of absolute essence. And you think that this essence is the economic relations. But the significance of economic relations as it concerns Marx and Engels is not as some kind of fundamental substance of all reality. but as the deeper essence, in a sense of an essence that is not already superimposed with a specific form. So to be clear by what that means, Marx and Engels acknowledge all of the spiritual, geopolitical, political, and so on realities. They are not substituting those realities for economic relations. They are just saying, what is the manner by which these realities actually, in real reality, how do they actually reproduce themselves? Like, how do they actually, you can even look at this from a kind of perspective of Aristotelian metaphysics. Like, how are they actually being? How are they actually reproducing their existence? And all they have done is introduced this question for the first time in the examination of history, where historians, as they noted, had always ignored this question. How is it that human beings really do reproduce themselves in a given historical epoch? We should, and they're saying we're not going to just reduce this to the ideas and the things that they have and the ways that they're conceptualizing and conceiving this. So this is not a form of economic reductionism whatsoever, because it's just a question of how are they actually reproducing themselves, not what necessarily causes. The question of causation is latent with the baggage of Anglo-Saxon metaphysics from the 17th century, which is about cause and effect, some kind of deeper primordial cause or kind of Spinozan substance from which all reality is just the result of, the kind of first cause. That's not, it has nothing to do with the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels, or Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, for that matter. And if we understand their fundamental ontology, their fundamental philosophical basis of Marxism, it becomes very clear that from Marx to Engels to Lenin to Stalin to Mao to Deng and to Xi, there is a very clear and consistent continuity. It's just not a continuity that can be defined on the basis of a fixed doctrinal form. But the whole point of Marxism...
Maoists separated themselves from fascists by rejecting a command economy and commitment to class struggle. I mean, I don't see how Deng didn't completely overturn this. You know, China's embraced class collaboration. It's embraced nationalism, authoritarianism. You know, they're integrating like a racial conception of nationalism into their conception of the state. I mean, it's like ship of Theseus. Like, at which point does it stop being communist, or do we just have to accept that because Deng is a successor to Mao, that you know, whatever he determines is in the Marxist lineage? Well, then it just means nothing.
Mussolini can trace himself back to Marx as well. I mean, you could trace Italian syndicalism from Marxism.
Former Marxists.
Okay, I can address what you say, because it's a fair question, right? Why is it that we do not see a clear and overt form of class struggle with not only in the Deng era, but even in the Mao era, right? Because remember, Mao understood there's a patriotic bourgeoisie, there's a patriotic petty bourgeoisie that the Communist Party is trying to align itself with. So, and then you can even go back to Stalin and the era of the Popular Front, and then the people's democracies after World War II. So the reason for that is because we cannot make assumptions about the form that class struggle is going to take. Now, the point of Mao's
why should I believe that this is still class struggle? I mean, they've embraced class collaboration. No, because I'll explain. Because class struggle is not just, doesn't only take the form of political conflict between different political parties. Class struggle can also take the form of the imminent development of a society in such a way that comes at the expense of certain classes and benefits other classes. Yeah, that's what fascism did with economic corporatism.
But I don't see how that was in the history of fascism.
What do you mean? There was a gradual, I mean, China went from communism and gradually introduced, you know, market reforms. It became more market oriented, more billionaires, more private ownership. Italy started from a more laissez-faire position, and they gradually transitioned. They had a few years of laissez-faire to kind of build up the economy. It was hugely successful. They had one of the fastest growth rates in Europe. In the 30s, they switched to a more corporatist.
The IRI and the
yeah, sure. I mean, you know, by the mid 30s, like 47% of Italian capital in the stock exchange is owned by the government. And by the time you get to 43 with the Italian Social Republic, it's more socialist than China is today. It's like 74%. Everything with more than 100 employees.
I can address all three of the points you just raised. So the first one is regarding to the question of the way in which it's the same in Italy. But listen, the key to understanding China and then modern China lies in land reform. Without understanding land reform, there's no meaning to Chinese communism. And by land reform, I mean the fact that despite all of the proletarianization that accompanied Chinese modernization, all the Chinese people still have some kind of social security safety net in the form of these small plots of intensive agricultural plots that they are given and granted by the state to have exclusive cultivation of. And then now with the Xi era, because they want to modernize agriculture more, they're starting to replace that with giving everyone homes, free, basically, housing.
Yeah, I can respond to this.
Single unit apartments. So I just want to this is just kind of the first point.
Yeah,
Now,
I'll respond to this. And again,
I'll do the two more points.
I mean, you've done like
respond.
most of the talking on this out of everyone.
Yeah. But it's important. It's important to discuss what you said about Italy, because it's interesting, because in the interwar years, the form of land ownership from 1900 to 1919 was gradually being taken away from absentee landlords who owned, 80% of the land in Sicily, 65% of the land in Calabria, and elsewhere within Italy. I mean, like, we have an overwhelming monopoly of large landowners who owned all the land. With the rise of the fascist government, the popular uprisings, which were taking this land from the absentee landlords who are using the land for speculative purposes to fund banks that gave loans to industrialists, the fascists crushed these uprisings and returned all the land to the landlords. And the fundamental ownership of the land in Italy did not change in the 1930s. Now, regarding the IRI and the so-called nationalizations, these were akin to bailouts of already bankrupted companies and failed capitalist enterprises, which in a free market economy would have just dissolved and been replaced. The government kept these, they propped them up. The same people who owned them were still in effect running them. It's just the government was claiming it was controlling and owning them. In reality, they were transferring these industrial companies under the control of finance capital. And it's for these reasons that
the government purchasing 74% of the economy is being ruled by finance capital. What a load of bullshit, man.
All right, Haz, hold on. One at a time. Wait. Finish up what you're saying, Haz, and then let Keith get in, because I know he's chomping at the bit. So just go ahead and finish up there real quick.
Just to Joel really quick. The devil's in the details. You have to understand what is meant by this ownership. It's more an oversight over, allowing these former capitalists and industrialists to retain their position, which they were not going to because they went bankrupt. So the government bailed them out and called this a form of nationalization. The final thing about the Italian Social Republic, really, really quick, 2 seconds. This was Mussolini's attempt to pander to a population that was already overwhelmingly disposed to socialism and communism, and they saw right through it. So it was a last-ditch effort by Mussolini to win over the trust of the Italian masses, which he failed to do.
All right, now go ahead, Keith.
Okay, well, firstly, on the land reform, yes, when the fascist governments took over, there was a massive land reform. But again, I feel like you're just ignoring geopolitical realities. The fascists had this conception that there are proletarian nations like Italy and Germany that are kept underdeveloped by Anglo-American mercantile powers, and that it was necessary to develop productive forces. This is the same kind of thinking as Sun Yat-sen. It's the same kind of thinking as the CCP now. And they put growth and industrialization ahead of these reforms. Mussolini did embrace a kind of qualified laissez-faire when he first came to power, specifically to develop productive forces, and it was successful. But it's not true that there was no land reform. And again, they were constrained in such a way that they had to do this gradually. In terms of the nationalization in the 1930s, it's not true that the governance structure didn't change. These companies that were nationalized, they introduced a corporatist governance structure. Labor and capital got equal representation on boards that ran these companies. And when you get into the 40s, there actually is massive land reform. They instituted a bill which is similar to the one you were talking about in China, where uncultivated land and absentee landlords, this land was seized and it was actually dispersed among cooperatives and local farmers. So, I mean, this idea that, well, it was just to placate people at that point. Well, you can say that, but Mussolini considered the Italian Social Republic the true essence of fascism, and he lamented that during his time in power, he'd been held back by conservatives. He had a king that constrained him. I mean, the first fascist government was a coalition government. There was liberals in there. There was leftists. So if you're going to say that, well, the early period where they embraced laissez-faire temporarily to develop productive forces, and they were in coalition with liberals, and he was constrained by the king. That's the true fascism. But then when he had like complete total rule in the 40s, and he starts nationalizing, he starts doing land reform, he introduces radical social welfare bills that control 74% of the economy. Well, that's fake fascism because he's just trying to placate people. Why would I buy that? Because the latter stage is actually what's representative of early fascist thought. And, you know, all of the early fascists, that's the kind of way that they conceive fascism. I mean, Mussolini appointed Nicola Bombacci, the former head of the Italian Communist Party, as his economics minister in the Italian Social Republic. You know, you're going to say that these people were just like duped. You
got to take into consideration the geopolitical conditions of China as well. Like, China was an agrarian society. And so obviously land reform is going to be the first thing that they do. Whereas if you're talking about like a far more industrialized kind of nation, like, you know, Germany or something under like Hitler, it's a completely different set of priorities that
it would have been suicidal to just do this radical.
You look in you look at the USSR.
Was
I can protest. I don't want to talk too much, so I just want to briefly address the 2 points because I've been talking a lot, but just really quick. Land reform is the only basis proven by history to have an independent path to industrialization without seizing overseas colonies and in waging wars of aggression against your neighbors to seize their resources. Land reform specifically is the key to industrialization because it allows the surpluses of agricultural production to be directed for the specific purpose of industrialization. Because countries like Italy and Germany were never able to do this, they had to mobilize their entire economy and countries for the purposes of war rather than internal industrial development. So that's the point about land reform. Now, secondly, there wasn't actually any major land reform that distributed the land away from the landowners in the 30s and the 20s. Now, regarding the land reform during the Italian Social Republic, admittedly, my knowledge of the land reform specifically that happened then is a little bit limited. But what I do know about the Italian Social Republic is that the words and the decrees by the government that were happening in fiat, the actual ruling classes and the actual like way in which the society was being governed in actual reality were two completely different realities.
That's not true. They nationalized 80 of the biggest companies in Italy. They had 150,000 employees combined.
On paper.
Well, that's sort of like when we did too big to fail bailouts. And it's like the idea that like we nationalized Lehman Brothers or something.
No, it's not. That you can say
it's not like that at all. Lehman Brothers don't do anything productive.
You can say
that's our industry.
No, like if we nationalized like General Motors, Ford, like all these like actual things, companies that produce.
Italy never nationalized anything in any meaningful sense. They just allowed these
nationalized the Bank of Italy.
They looted the Italian people to allow these bankrupt companies to have a lifeline when they otherwise in the free market.
No, hold on. Okay, so 1938 in Italy, the state controlled 77% of iron production. Okay, 67%.
What do you mean by control?
It was controlled by the IRI.
But what does that? What do you mean? What does that control mean? The devil's in the details. Remember, the control is not a direct form of control like in the Soviet Union. Where
okay, so who's controlling it? You know, when all of this is
the IRI is an institution that was. By the way, the IRI was an institution that was maintained for the purposes of steel production within Italy long after fascists. I don't know about long; it's relative, but it was continued through the 50s and the 60s. It actually remained as an institution.
Yeah, up to the year 2000.
And it was mainly a kind of financial organ that didn't actually directly control anything. It just was an organ that was directed for the purposes of fulfilling a certain industrial policy and industrial aim.
Okay, and who was it acting on behalf of, if not the state?
It was. The IRI was acting on behalf of the state.
Okay, well, how is that any different from China? China has, like, private banks, but they own most of the shares. That's the same thing as the IRI. Italy had the state body that controlled most of the shares of these companies and nationalized some of them.
But the difference is that all of the Chinese companies that exist now have been emerged and developed from the ground up, from the soil of the Chinese
people.
Well,
they had different...
That's because China was starting with fuck all to begin with.
Different places.
Yeah.
They're like,
the obvious
they're in the middle
point
of Europe.
Is
they're up against these mercantile powers.
Listen, when we Marxists... but we Marxists...
And they're going from a market economy to socialism.
But listen, you have to understand...
From socialism to more market economy.
The difference, though, is that if these companies are coming and emerging from the soil of the Chinese people, that means the state was overseeing not only what these companies are doing, but where their actual development, it was actually responsible for where they came from and their emergence in the first place. So it's not the same thing. And the second thing that's important to understand here is the fact that the reason Marxists say that fascism was the emergency organ of industrial and finance capitalists wasn't because we believe that they directly controlled fascists or even funded the majority of the fascist resources, but precisely because these social formations and these economic structures, which would have otherwise not existed and would have been wiped out as a result of the crisis in 29, they were allowed to retain a lifeline because of fascism. Whereas in China, for example,
why should I believe that there was Germany and Italy were supposedly on the precipice of a communist revolution? Why didn't it happen in England or?
I don't think they were on the precipice of a communist revolution. I don't believe they were.
Okay, so what was going to happen in 1929 that didn't happen in Britain or France or Spain?
Britain, I'll tell you, Britain, France, and Spain, and the United States, all embarked on quasi-corporatist and socialistic policies to save their economies as well. So I don't know what you're really asking.
If fascism goes socialist, it's it's in the aid of capitalism, because there surely would have been like a greater proper socialist revolution.
No, it's not that there would have been a socialist revolution, but there would have probably been an economic restructuring of the economy in some kind of way. Like new companies would have emerged at the expense of old ones, and new order would have emerged at the expense of
who cares if it's a new company or it's just an old one, if the state is taking it over and introducing a corporatist governance structure and giving labor equal representation and directing the direction of the company. I mean, it's like, okay, fine. So these capitalists in China, they developed while the CCP was in charge, and if Jack Ma steps out of line, they'll throw him in jail. Well, what's the difference? I mean, Germany had already existing capitalists.
The difference is that
if they stepped out of line,
it's precisely. I'll explain it to you. It's very simple, actually. The difference is precisely the fact that the fascist countries are too corporatist in a kind of political sense of the word. They did not have the sufficient degree of control over these companies to be able to completely wholesale reform and open up economies, eliminate industries, completely reform and change everything about their economy from the bottom up. The Chinese state now does have the power to do that because it gets
and after all the reform,
totally different context. But
listen,
how long has the CCP been in? The CCP's been in.
Listen, right now,
CCP's been in for 70 years. They started with an agrarian society.
Right now in the Xi era, there's a fundamental restructuring. And I'm saying the reason why the Chinese state is able to do this is because it gets its mandate directly from the small scale land holding or apartment holding, whatever, the Chinese people. That is where it gets its mandate. That is its sole authority. The Xi era is being characterized by this complete transformation of the various industries and sectoral interests and so on of the Chinese economy that is coming at the expense of, there's no corporatism here between class collaboration. Classes are being eliminated wholesale because of the government's 5-year plans and policies, and they can't do anything about it. The government doesn't have to compromise with any classes. It doesn't have to negotiate with them. It will pursue an industrial policy, and it'll pursue a developmental policy solely according to the interests of the Chinese people.
Were completely left out of the decision-making policies in that.
That's not
Germany.
What I just said, though. That's not relevant to what I said.
about Germany, etc. Like a lot of that stuff, like really, like why did Ford have to create a sub spin-off brand for Nazi Germany? That was due to American policies. It was not that Germans had no problem with Ford running plants with American out of America in Germany.
Okay, so that proves that capitalists were directing the National Socialists.
I'm saying that they didn't have a problem with it. I'm saying that the change was not determined from within their society. It was determined within ours.
So let's see, which country has more Wall Street dollars in it? National Socialist Germany or fucking China? I think China by billions and billions and billions.
Well, the reason for that
70% of the Chinese economy is privatized at this point. As in terms of it actually has capitalists.
Exports are private.
What do you mean by private though?
That there's someone called a capitalist who invests in the company and gets surplus value, in response for their investment.
I don't even.
Aren't you fucking Marxist?
Yeah, but that doesn't even really describe capitalist countries anymore. So it's really not true.
What do you mean it's not true? Are you telling me that aren't people called investors in China who invest in stock in China that make money off that stock?
If you're talking, are you talking
according
about
to Marx? That's the
if you're
capitalist
talking
mode of
about
production, correct?
If you're talking about financial derivatives and speculation, it is heavily restricted.
I'm talking about buying stock. I'm buying stock, buying trading stock.
I think for individuals, it's actually restricted within China. You can't just speculate on the stock market.
Yeah, it's like an institutional thing. You have to basically, that's like your job. It's like that's your job in the state. Is
Yeah,
like
you
the
can't
state's
just do that
capitalist.
freely.
So I don't know what is that.
Yeah, but okay, so you can't do it freely. So they basically protect a certain class of capitalists and only let them do it.
They're state servants.
No,
There's literally like
civil
servants.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, man, I'd love to be a billionaire state servant. Yeah,
that's good, right? But it comes with a trade-off, right? It comes with a trade-off because your billions, all of that money, if you're Jack Ma, you don't have
you don't control
that a capitalist has in America.
So let me explain it to you.
I'm still taking the billion.
Let's say you're a billionaire within China, right?
How does that not apply to Germany?
Let's say you're a billionaire within China, right? Billionaire is going to be your net worth. It's going to be your total holdings. In China, you are not free to just liquidate that wealth and do what you want with it. It's your wealth is being controlled.
Sure, you got a fucking nice car, nice house, sexy wife.
Yeah,
you're living well.
Okay.
Listen,
what's wrong with civil servants doing
Marx?
I'm not the fucking communist in this conversation. I got no problem with it.
Joel,
I'm a communist. I'm saying
Italy had a reform that foreigners couldn't buy stocks in Italian companies.
That's fine, but let's go back to Marx here. And Marx's critique of the Gotha program, what you're describing is inequality. Some people have nice cars and nice houses, and some people don't.
I don't get how.
No, what I'm describing is the capitalist mode of production. That's what I'm describing.
No, you're describing the cultural phenomena of inequality. But Marx himself
is there surplus value or not?
But Marx, we can talk about surplus value later, but Marx himself described within the critique of the Gotha program that in a socialist society, inequality will still prevail. And Lenin described the same thing because you will be compensated on the basis of your work, right? According to your work, but people have different degrees of being able to do different kinds of work because of contingencies. So that's how Chinese Marxists will explain it. Some people, for contingent reasons, it's almost like an American capitalist talking point you hear. Like they worked harder, and they got more money, right? It's different from just being a capitalist per se, because a capitalist presupposes the institution of private property first and then the profits later. It's not based on your labor. So
yeah, I understand that it's technocratically
it's very
administered.
Difficult. I would argue that it's colloquially.
All of this applies to National Socialist Germany. I mean, they brought in a wage leveling law that restructured wages so that it was based on the effort of the worker rather than anything else. Changed 97% of wages.
That's for wages, though. That's not for the industrial capitalist and financial capitalist class that was still.
It is, yeah.
Germany's economy.
Yeah, they lowered their wages. They
literally nationalized the whole like so much of the banking system.
They're not getting paid. They're not getting paid wages. They're not a wage earning class primarily. They're a class that earns their money through profit.
These Chinese billionaires are not a wage earning class either.
I didn't say they were.
Yeah, well, exactly. So what's the fucking difference?
Well, the point he brought up wasn't specifically relevant because the underlying point I'm trying to say here is that there's no corporatism. There's no negotiating with any segment of the CCP does not share power with any class or segment of Chinese society. It is solely accountable to the Chinese people.
Now, what is their let me ask a question.
Authoritarian workers' vanguard. I mean, that's fascism.
I'm going to ask a question
it's the reason why it's a proletarian dictatorship is because the proletariat is only meaningful within this wider context of the people as a whole. The proletariat, the reason why it's a proletarian dictatorship is because the proletariat is the class that emerged, that was uprooted from its means of subsistence and its means of production. And the proletarian dictatorship is specifically attuned to allowing the Chinese people to endure revolutions in the forces of production, which will inevitably uproot them from their original means of production. The small-holding agriculture is being uprooted, and Xi is responding to that. Instead of throwing these people on the street and leaving them with nothing, like in a capitalist society, they're getting free.
All right, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to let you talk some more. I'm asking you a question, so you'll still get to talk. Now, you mentioned earlier that there is a continuity between going all the way back to Marx to Xi, the guy you just mentioned. What is that continuity? If you want to get super specific, you can. But I think that's pretty important.
I don't want to ramble, but I would describe it to simplify it concretely. It's the dialectic between form and content. So for Marx, this originally takes the form of the kind of the whole structure, apparatus, or whatever you want to call it, the project of German idealism, culminating in Hegel's system. For Marx, the real content of this system, the real truth of the insight of Hegel, lies in the material reality of the proletariat. So this is the first way in which Marx initiates his kind of discovery. Real human, and then in the case of Feuerbach has an imagined humanity, right? He's a humanist, but his human is idealized. Marx says, no, this is humanity is no idle abstraction of the imagination. Humanity is the real and determinate humanity, specifically as it takes the form of the proletariat. Then Lenin comes, and Lenin is dealing with the institution of European social democracy, and he's trying to bring this into Russia. So, and Lenin discovers that the real essence of this institution, of the party form, cannot actually be found in the ready-made forms legislated by the party itself, but must be, you must delve deeper and deeper into the ground, into the soil of the Russian peasantry, right? So it's this. And then you can keep going with Stalin. Stalin doesn't actually call himself an innovator of Marxism. He just says he's the most faithful servant of Lenin. And Stalin's collectivization and his wager upon the Russian middle peasants is an extension of Lenin's fundamental discovery. And then Mao continues this by almost eliminating the significance of the industrial proletariat altogether and recognizing that the fundamental class differentiations are to be found in the Chinese people, specifically the Chinese peasant more generally. So then Mao is this more kind of populist contribution. Then with Deng Xiaoping is the final nail in the coffin to the Soviet the legacy of the Soviet-inspired system of central planning, which actually Mao was always in tension with and contradicting from the very beginning. Sorry, there's kind of an echo. So with Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, the real innovation and insight of Maoism, which is striving away from this kind of top-down, centralized or overly centralized kind of institutionalized, bureaucratic Soviet system where everything is just planned, to a system that actually develops socialism from the soil of the Chinese people themselves. And now with the Xi era, after the development of the forces of production, we are now opening into a new era of an authentic communist morality. So the question remains, now that we have developed the forces of production, what is the aesthetic, cultural, so on and so on? What values will define the orientation of the development of the forces of production? And this kind of spiritual orientation is what defines the Xi era. So
that's just so like ironic to me because because you guys are like, you love Hegel and you love Marx, and it's just the way you describe that, it's almost like I'm listening to Giovanni Gentile or some shit, because with Hegel, you got this move from the concrete subject to the abstract object, and then Marx flips that on its head with his materialism, right? You have the concrete object, you move to the kind of abstract subject
to the concrete.
Yeah, and so that's but Hegel in the philosophy of right. I mean, I don't like Hegel's metaphysics that much, but the philosophy of right I find profound, where you have this kind of distinction between this like classical distinction that goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy, like in Western political thought, really, between this polarity between anarchy and tyranny. On the one hand, you have this notion of like the free conscience. The self-actualization of the individual, but if you just kind of, what's the dude's name? Max Stirner is like, just going all in on that. You just become just. Well, the other direction is you have this notion of like, the collective good, the legal and moral principles of the political. But if you completely negate like the individual's role, then you're a tyrant. And Hegel says, okay, we've got to find some kind of sublation of this dichotomy. We've got to kind of synthesize these things together, and so it becomes the kind of voluntary identification with, of the individual with the collective good. Now, Hegel is a libtard, so he has this like, he has this kind of defense of Enlightenment liberalism.
He's
a little
a Republican.
Bit.
He's not.
Yeah,
he's a Republican.
Whatever.
All the time.
The point is. This notion of like this notion of the identification as would have been understood in Hegel's day is within this bourgeois liberal context. Whereas when you get to the 20th century, obviously we live in mass society, the effects of mass production. There's a completely different kind of conception of civil society at this point. We don't have this kind of elite bourgeois civil discourse. Now we have like this mass-produced kind of inundation of ideological kind of imposition by this kind of mass media system. And this is the context out of which fascism, communism and progressivism, they all kind of rise in this early 20th century, and so-called mass democracy. And in this context, Gentile comes along as a respecter of Marx and Hegel, and he says, okay, so in order to like achieve this synthesis between the individual and the collective, there needs to be an identification with a kind of spiritual mission of the state. And you could see, Mussolini talk about that the conception of the state ultimately is religious in fascism, that there is a kind of, and this is not done in a way that just completely negates Marx either, but it's this kind of synthesis of the idea that the subject is not just an individual unto himself as in the kind of classical Enlightenment conception, but instead the subject kind of actively constructs himself in his self-actualization within within like his relation to the spiritual idea of the state. Now, this is why I can kind of respect the Chinese, in a profound way, because you can see that there's this kind of authenticity that they're trying to strive towards which is why I also respect the cessation of this kind of class struggle nonsense and this striving toward this concept of, the national idea as ultimately the kind of basis for its legitimacy. But like, to me, there's so much, I don't understand how you guys can just sit there and not see like there's a massive amount of convergence between what was going on in Italy with these fascist intellectuals in the early 20th century and the development in Chinese thought the last few decades. Yeah, you can say, there's little subtle differences.
Way things could have gone. Things could have gone differently, but the thing is, right, is like in actual material history, like who did the fascists like decide that their ally was? Did they decide to ally with the Soviet Union and the forces of communism? Because if they had, they probably would have been able to.
I think I can actually
the Anglo-Atlantic world.
Yeah,
but
and also
this is where geopolitics comes in, though, because Germany.
It's not about ideology here.
Germany was not in the same position that China was in. Like we all talk about land reform and how like when Mao first comes to power, the Soviets send over, this is what we did with Stalin. You guys should try this, command economy. They tried for a bit and go, this is fucked. We're not doing this.
Yeah, I can
because the Chinese didn't have to do it because they weren't in the same geopolitical stress that the Russians were in, and also the Germans. The Germans knew if we don't. The kind of Lebensraum kind of concept in National Socialist ideology, that's a geopolitical concept that predates National Socialist ideology by decades. And basically the idea, the Germans knew if we don't expand this state militarily into the east, and gain new territory, we're going to get cucked by America. We're going to get
because they couldn't do land reform. Because they didn't do land reform.
They didn't have land. Like they it not in the same capacity as
they didn't want to. They didn't
have time. They didn't have time. They had to go from 0 to 100 like that. They had to build a war machine like that.
The Soviet Union had time.
The Soviet Union, the Soviet Union, as I said, brutalized their people as well to create.
It's not just about land reform.
The kulaks are chilling. The kulaks already liberated.
If Germany cooperated with the Soviet Union peacefully, then both of their developmental needs could have been reached without those tragedies. Germany's technical expertise could have helped develop the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's resources could have fulfilled the needs of the German industrialization. So they didn't. But I just wanted to go back.
The Japanese didn't declare war, didn't bomb Pearl Harbor, but invaded Russia from the other side. Maybe things could have been different too.
Here's an important distinction though that we have to draw, I think, between, because you mentioned Gentile and stuff. I just want to talk briefly about that. I think the most important distinction here is that for Marx, the issue is not so much the contradiction between the individual and the collective. The issue is really, this is the crux of the contradiction between the state and the civil society. Marx's entire point is that Hegel's civil society is an imagined civil society that does not fundamentally, and like Hegel's idea is basically like, here you have the state and it must reconcile itself and be harmonious with its origins and its real foundations in the civil society. As Marx pointed out, though, the two actually do enter into contradiction with each other in such a way that the state becomes annihilated in civil society. And this was actually the fate of Prussian constitutional monarchy, monarchy itself, is that it was annihilated because of what was going on in the imminent development of civil society. The distinction with fascism, though, that's relevant here is that despite what you might think and what we're taught by Cold War propaganda, communist states are not total states. And what I mean by that is that these are states that are cognizant of their own imminent limitation, their own inability to permanently conquer their origins and their material basis in civil society. And that's why I say the only contract that the CCP is going to negotiate with is the Chinese people, because in contrast to the kind of Mussolini idea that the state and the people are one and they're actually the same thing, China recognizes, and the Soviet Union also recognizes in its own way, that the state and the people are not actually always already the same thing. There is a contradiction between them, and the state must acknowledge its own limitation in this regard. This is why, for example, with Stalin's collectivization, the kolkhozes are not state-owned property. They are actually collective farms owned and property of the collective farm. Stalin must acknowledge, and Stalin writes this in his Economic Problems of the USSR, which is, this is why we have a socialist commodity. This is why we need prices. This is why commodities persist, because we cannot just go to the peasants and just loot and steal all of their land and their resources. It belongs to them. We, the state, cannot make it state property because this would amount to a form of robbery of the peasants.
I just want to say something.
This is pure ideology.
Before we move off.
But this is pure ideology because the reality in Russia was obviously, like for many centuries, the peasantry of Russia was under the boot of the gentry.
No, but otherwise it was collectively owned for most of the Russian peasantry owned the land collectively. Even
they were liberated by the Tsar already, like in many cases, like at least partially. But then once you get the degeneration of the Russian political system, in World War I, where everything goes to shit, prior to the Bolsheviks seizing power, the peasants basically were basically liberated at this point. They completely.
You're talking about Stolypin reforms. There were Stolypin reforms, which
but not even talking about reforms at this point. Like by the time when the Bolsheviks first seized power, they don't even have control of the rural areas. Like they it was a proletarian revolution, right? So they had control of the urban areas. But they had very limited control of the rural areas, and basically the rural areas were like law unto themselves. They were in many cases. They didn't really have a good enough incentive to participate in the Soviet in the early.
The Bolshevik Revolution was possible because the Bolsheviks promised land reform, and the soldiers.
No. This is bullshit. This is absolute bullshit. It was a proletarian revolution. The peasants reluctantly went along with it because they were like, oh fuck, we don't want the aristocracy coming back.
No, the only reason the Bolsheviks succeeded is because they didn't promise and initiate a program of land reform, which the soldiers and sailors and those people who did come from peasant families and backgrounds were very responsive to and recipient to, and as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution, large, noble, and proprietary estates were divided and given to the peasants.
I'm pretty sure the peasants were kind of happy being left alone, not Stalin showing up with a bunch of dudes from the cities to point guns in people's faces and force them to do shit on their own land.
Most of them had the land in common in some kind of way already when it was redistributed. But the second thing is, as a result of the Stolypin reforms, there was a form of specific individual land ownership. And this gave rise to the kulak, but it was an artificial invention of the Stolypin reforms that was not an organic feature or character of the Russian peasantry or the Russian people. And that's why the kulaks posed such an issue for.
Oh yeah, so sending a bunch of like dudes in from the city with fancy uniforms to start running these farms bureaucratically, have this managerial class come in and oppress them and take all their shit.
It was an extremely violent thing that happened. It was extremely oppressive, extremely violent.
But it's totally it's antithetical.
Joel, but all I'm going to insist upon is a crucial difference, that this is the foundation of all modern industrial and modernity in general to begin with. And this violence will either happen in your own country. I mean, hopefully now we're at a state we don't need this anymore because the differences in the concentration of capital. We have China now, which can help develop countries so they don't have to go through this. But this is the hidden origin of modernity itself. If it's not going to be your own country, it's going to be someone else.
Yeah, I said at the beginning, I didn't criticize Stalin. I said Stalin was presented with pretty much an impossible choice.
All right, now let me put a pin in this. Let me let Keith get in there because I'll let you guys go long, and I know he wanted to talk like.
I just want to say something like, because Logo dropped in this thing. Oh well, the fascists, they chose to like ally with the capitalist powers and they went after the Soviet Union. I mean, I think everything Logo's dropped in so far is just like straight up wrong. Like it's just like basic bitch like communist myths.
Well, what's wrong about that?
What's wrong about that? Well, it's not true.
What's wrong about like the fact that the fascists presented themselves specifically as anti-communist? Like,
yeah, I'm going to explain. Well, okay, so Hitler throughout the 20s and 30s, most fascists don't get this either, but he always presented Anglo-American Jewish capitalism as the primary threat. And the first mention from Hitler of anti-Semitism is the Geimlich letter, and there's no mention of communism in it. He's talking about the Jews directing international capitalism and them identifying more than Jews than their nation state. And when he starts to mention communism, he talks about it as a phenomenon that's directed from Wall Street. And he never mentions communism as a primary threat, except in kind of public speeches and propaganda. But he sees it as a way for international finance capital to weaken nations. Now, in terms of like the invasion of Russia, a lot of the National Socialists in the 1930s, before they got elected, wanted to go ahead with this position of moving forward with an alliance of Russia and focus on the West. Hitler's reason for rejecting this was purely like geopolitical. You're talking about land reform, but I mean, there was a different conception of like development at that time, and Hitler very much had this conception of kind of space and race, and his experience of sort of fighting German descended soldiers in US uniforms in World War I really influenced this. And Hitler believed that if a European power didn't emerge with the kind of scale of the United States, that no one would be able to take on the hegemony of the emerging North American power, as he called it. So Hitler struck east, but it was very much with this long-term thinking that Germany would either become a great power, the magnitude of the US, that could challenge capitalist hegemony over the world, or to be destroyed. And he says this in speeches throughout the 20s and 30s. He contrasts, he compared Germany. He said that the fate of Germany would be like India or Ireland, that it would be one of these dispossessed colonial nations. And, his thinking was very much that, it was expansion or destruction. I mean, there's a quote from the Brendan Sims.
There's a lot of American capitalists who said the same thing, though. Okay,
so Brendan Sims says this is like a popular biography that came out on Hitler recently. He's a pretty respected historian. The crucial point is that Hitler did not primarily justify the quest for Lebensraum with the inherent inferiority of the Slav population there as an ideological war against Bolshevism, or even as a first step towards the annihilation of Jews in Europe. His aim throughout was not world domination, but simple national survival. Hitler may have spoken privately of his hopes for world hegemony, but this was probably bluster. It's more likely that, at least at this stage, Hitler did not envisage world domination by Germany as opposed to the world power status necessary for survival. And you also have his second book, which he didn't actually publish because it gave away too much of his geopolitical thinking. But throughout the second book, when he's talking about expanding east, the primary threat throughout is the Anglo-Saxon capitalist powers, as they call them. And again, the line of thinking is that either Germany is going to get enough space to the east to industrialize sufficiently to challenge the United States, or it's going to perish. So, I mean, just like reading ideology into this, I mean, fascists do this as well. Like, oh, is this great crusade against communism? Like, I mean, it's just like juvenile stuff.
Yeah, but okay, so what if, but like, do you think, like, what, okay, so you're saying fundamentally, like, so they weren't primarily anti-capitalist, they were primarily anti-communist, but they just considered communism to be essentially like another hand of the capitalists, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, they were just saying propaganda to justify their geopolitical interests, which was Hitler didn't give a fuck about the Russians.
When they led with the anti-communist stuff, I mean, that's
the choice was okay. Like it's us or them. Like either we expand or we die.
Here's the issue. The issue is that there's two things, right? Hitler was very clear that he wanted to divide the world with the British Empire. He admired the British Empire, and he was not against the British Empire per se. Now, I guess he did talk about Anglo-American Jewish capitalists or whatever, but the fact is that Hitler expanded east primarily because he was wanted to make the signal to the Western powers that, hey, I'm just going to go take on the Soviet Union. If you leave me alone, it really doesn't concern you, right? And he thought that he would get away with invading Poland, doing all these things and breaking treaties with England and these other countries because he thought that they would just not mind him confronting the Soviet Union and going eastward. So, I mean, I don't know what his imagined long-term goal necessarily is. Like, oh, he wants to compete with America or whatever. But concretely, like specifically as it's relevant to the situation there, Hitler was making signals to the Anglo-American ruling classes, whether they're Jewish or otherwise, as it doesn't really concern me, that he was going to be their champion against the Soviet Union.
Well, yeah, he wanted to avoid a world war with Britain. But I mean, he still saw capitalism as the primary threat, and he was trying to create a powerful enough state to take that on. I mean,
it was not in Germany's interest to go to war with Britain because Britain had nothing to offer Germany, like geopolitically.
I know. I don't think Germany wanted to go to war with Britain, but I think, I think that Germany wanted to get away with invading the East, and they thought they would just get away with this. But the problem,
but it's not about ideology. It's not about like, oh, fascism is inherently this, and it's about the cold geopolitical reality of the situation that he was in. Much like Stalin's behavior, much like Mao's behavior, they were able to make different decisions because they had different material historical circumstances.
Here's the thing: is that I get it that it was in the interest of the German economy, as within the specific political order the Nazis were ruling, that yes, they needed more resources and they needed more space to appease the German population, which was not being given a land reform internally. But the reason for that was because the Nazis, you can either say that they were acting on behalf of, or they had to compromise with the German monopolists and landowners. The fact stands that this was why they had to, there was an internal kind of social tension within Germany that they had to mitigate by promising the German people that they're going to get their plot of land and their homestead in the East.
This is also why they failed, because they were beholden to this class. This class didn't give a shit about the Nazis in the first place.
They're not beholden to the class. I mean,
No. Listen. I'm making a point.
Hitler said
let me finish my fucking point, man. Please, I haven't talked that much.
He wanted to create a classless society in the long run. So I mean, the idea that this was like serving the capitalist class.
Can I finish my point? I'm talking about just cold geopolitical realities here. Okay, so
you're really not.
Hitler's. Yes, I am. I'm about to, if you let me. Okay. So Hitler's, all of these monopolists, the landowners, basically the ancient regime, like the fucking hereditary aristocracy of Germany at the time, they supported Hitler to a point. But as soon as there was going to be any attempt at land reform in that sense, that is when they collaborated extremely hand in glove with British capitalists, and the German secret intelligence service was literally all double agents for the British.
What you're saying is Hitler. What you're saying is that Hitler was based and he got betrayed by a bunch of capitalists.
I'm saying he didn't. No, I'm saying because he didn't do the land reform early enough. If he did that, if he was doing land reform early enough, then maybe he would have stood a chance at all.
Look,
the
you slipped in another myth. Who were the major capitalists supporting Hitler prior to his election?
Henry Ford.
To name one, what was the financial support for the Nazi Party by Henry Ford?
Multiple elections. So which election are you referring to?
Okay, anytime prior to them taking power, what was the major?
After 32, he met with industrialists, and they supported him in the next election.
There was no election after. What do you mean after 32?
There was an election in 32, I believe, and then.
You mean in 32? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so this is from Henry Ashby Turner, who's a Yale historian who wrote the most authoritative book on this. He says big business support was virtually zero prior to the election of 1933. It reached a high point in the spring of 32, followed by a decline through the autumn that continued until Hitler's appointment as chancellor. But at the high point in 1932, the NSDAP seemed unstoppable. So at that point, the capitalists are trying to get on the winning team. But it's
not about whether or not they financially supported them. But I'm saying is that when he had to make up his state,
they didn't support them at all. There's literally two major industrialists that supported them.
Here's the thing. So prior to 32, I don't think that the majority of the ruling class in Germany was behind the Nazis and behind.
But they were massively opposed to them.
Well, that's debatable.
One of the biggest capitalists in Germany supported the Sten's revolt, which was this SA revolt that was trying to take out Hitler.
That's fine. But here's what's important. The Nazis would not have been able to seize and retain power if they did not act on behalf of the interests of the German ruling class. They did not come into power. My theory of Nazism
Why wasn't there support for them then?
What's that?
Why wasn't there support from them then, from the ruling class?
Well, because initially they were kind of like a street gang, right? But then they came to a point where they wanted to get elected and seize power, so they made a deal with the industrialists, said, hey, we're going to be the kind of anarchist thugs that are going to keep things in line and keep things...
they vastly supported
Hitler's
the Republic still right up to 1933. In fact, the Nazis actually took a more anti-capitalist line in 32.
But hold on, in 32, Hitler gave a
Reichstag.
speech to the group of German industrialists saying, hey, we're the best bet to save you guys and allow you guys to keep your position. He almost said this stuff ad verbatim in 32.
Yeah, and in 1933, so Turner says, it championed the prerogatives of the parliament and the interests of workers as part of an offensive designed to discredit Papin's presidential, what they called cabinet of barons. The NSDAP swerved sharply leftward.
Yeah, they were rhetoric and words. And
but where's the material support for the Nazis? I mean, you're saying like the kind of,
I don't think they had necessarily substantive material support among the German people to actually seize power. They were kind of an organization that was filled with many lumpen elements and declassed elements and middle class type of elements. And they were kind of a ragtag group of thugs, basically, right? And then they were, when the time came, they were allowed to have power by the German capitalists. So they never actually had a substantive base in the German people at all. It's just they were anarchists, more or less, who were allowed, they were unleashed on German society.
What does that mean that they never had substantive support? I mean, they won the election without support from major industrialists, with most industrialists supporting the Republic.
At what point did they win the election without the support of the industrialists?
1933.
No, by 33, they already had the industrialists behind them.
No, they didn't.
Yes, they did.
Who was supporting them?
All of them, all the major German
That's
industrialists.
not true. That's not true.
Yeah,
There was one industrialist that was openly pro-Nazi.
Openly, but I'm not talking about openly.
Okay, so how can you? Well, what are you going to do to prove it? Do you have any?
Yes,
Henry Ashby Turner wrote a book on this.
Let me try to look it up.
And he couldn't find one person except Fritz
Hitler's
Sisson
speech to industrialists.
Okay, so you're going to tell me his speech again. Where's the material support?
Okay, so if Hillary Clinton is giving speeches to major industrialists, do you think that there's any material support there, or is that just a coincidence?
Then there was also the secret meeting in 20th of February 1933. Hitler and 20 to 25 industrialists. He
often reached out to try and get support from industrialists, but it never materialized into anything.
No, he received the equivalent.
Okay, so once he's like fully in and he's like
he received the equivalent of around 10 million. What is today in today's terms? It was 2 million Reichsmarks at the time. Were contributed at the meeting, so he was given support.
From who?
Let me see. Let's go. This was all stuff from the
Turner's emphatic on this, that they raised a lot of money from small donations and they were really good at collecting a lot of small donations.
That was before.
No, it's the same right up to then.
No, it was before 32.
Turner says only through gross distortion can big business be afforded a crucial or even major role in the downfall of the Republic. He's absolutely emphatic on this.
Yeah, but he couldn't possibly be talking about what everyone.
Yeah, I mean, you're not giving me anything. You're like, oh, they had a meeting here and there. I mean, yeah, the party existed for what?
So I can actually show you.
It had nothing to do with their millions of members. It was just like these 3 capitalists that gave him a few mil on the start.
No, it's far more. IG Farben, 400,000 Reichsmarks. You have a guy named Der I.A. Stenke, 200,000. You have Karl Hermann, 150,000. Automobile Ostelag, Berlin, 100,000. Karl Hermann, Berlin, Deutsch, I can't pronounce this shit, 150,000. Pretty much a lot of people are giving them money here. It's not just 1 or 2 people.
I know where you're getting this from, because Turner says that there's only 2 major industrialists that supported the Nazis prior to their election, Sitzen and von Borsig. And Sisson ended up in
the which election is he talking
publicly,
about?
Prior to him getting into power, any of the elections, prior to him getting into power.
It must have been before the election of 33.
You're
probably talking about before the election of 32.
No, he's talking about them before getting into power. Like I said, I can give you the quote again. Only through gross distortion can big business be afforded a crucial or even major role in the downfall of the republic.
So he's talking about before 32.
No, the downfall of the republic when Hitler gets into power. Quote,
Well, okay, listen.
the consolidation of Hitler's regime
listen,
after
Turner,
he becomes
I
chancellor.
can't
He and his party had previously received relatively
So
little support from that quarter.
how does Turner address Hitler's speech to the Industry Club in 1932? Like, how does he address these kind of things?
Yeah, Turner,
were
yeah,
happening
of
in
course.
the 30s.
Like Hitler was trying to reach out to influential people. You know, one of
And you're
his
saying he
friends
failed.
one of his friends went to America to meet Henry Ford, but he'd never commit anything financially. You know, they were in touch with like the white Russian emigres, and they tried to reach out to industrialists. Or von Borsig, who was one of the two industrialists that supported him, tried to get before they got power. He tried to raise support in Berlin, and he was an anomaly. He gave up after a few months, and he doesn't seem to have supported them materially at all prior to getting into power.
But even if he got some cash on the side, you're telling me in like 1937
Much
that
enthusiasm
if one of these industrialists pissed Hitler off, that he couldn't do something about it, the dude consolidated his power. Sometimes you gotta play a little chess. You know what I mean?
Well,
I don't really
at
see a huge problem with it.
right
Yeah, but
now.
they went leftward before getting into power.
I'm looking at a source right now. Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, good
To
luck.
like sort of, I don't feel like my point was addressed, so I'll kind of expand on
Okay,
it.
hold on. I can.
point was,
Okay,
right,
the same
they didn't-
official
okay, you got it.
estimate
Yeah, okay.
to the total. Sorry, Logo. I don't mean to cut you off, man. I've just been looking through the source. Just go right after me, right? Total contributions for one of the Reichstag election campaigns of 32, and approximately 200,000 to 300,000 marks. Of this, he reported no more than. So 10 to 15% had gone to the Nazis, and this was in 32.
10 to 15% of what? Well, I gave you the quote that they
All the
reached big
contributions
support
to the
in
elections.
32, and then it
When
declined
attacks
shortly
on-
after, and they went leftward.
When did they go leftward?
In like the spring of 32, right up to getting
Yeah,
elected.
but this was in rhetoric. This wasn't actually what was going on behind the scenes.
What do you mean? What was happening behind the scenes? They got less support from big business before the 1933 election. I'll give you another quote from Turner. Quite contrary to the widespread impression that Hitler gained power in January 33 with strong backing from big business, his appointment to the chancellorship came just when relations between his movement and the business community had reached the lowest point since the NSDAP's election gains of 1930 had forced it upon the attention of the politically engaged men of big business.
Well, it's the lowest point, but relative to what? Because it's
So basically, he played the game. He got in position, and then once he had a run at power, he just started giving the middle finger.
Okay. Well,
Logo, why don't you go in?
Yeah, let
He
Logo
didn't
get
even
in.
get the material support to suggest
I'm going to read
it. Like,
more.
I'm not
Logo,
even
you
giving
can go
that.
ahead.
Go
Try and
ahead.
find the source. Good luck.
Go ahead.
So my point was that he, unlike the communists, right? The communists tended to depose the former order and replace it entirely with their own new order, right? So like this is why there was like tons of like purges and things, because you had a ton of like fucking intelligence agents and industrials and industrial assets and fucking capitalists all over the place from all over the world, really, in that country, who were trying to get what they could out of this new developing country. In Germany, Hitler didn't do that. He didn't get rid of these people. He didn't replace.
You got rid of a lot of
He
them,
didn't
yeah.
build
If they violated the national interest,
Maybe.
you got rid of them. Fritz Thyssen was the biggest supporter of the
at the
Nazis
end of the
prior to
day-
him getting power. He led the biggest steel
I didn't
company.
finish my point.
So Logo's
Nazis
critique of
got
Hitler
Power,
is
nationalized his business in
the
1930.
problem with
Yeah,
Hitler
Hitler
is
was
that
a
he didn't
loser.
kill enough people.
No, not enough of the
capital.
Okay, I have a quote right here.
Anyone that
didn't
opposed
replace the
national
Ancient
interest, he got rid of. He
Okay,
threw them
I'm
in
reading
concentration camps.
a source.
It's kind of true. Like Stalin was kind of way more badass in a way.
Stalin was way more badass.
Yeah,
This is page 68 of the book, Henry Turner, Big Business and the Rise of Hitler. He says, but more important, once he was in office, Hitler demonstrated that he was always reassured them, not a socialist. He therefore had no difficulty in extracting large sums from big business, starting with the campaign for the Reichstag election of March 1933. These contributions unquestionably aided Hitler significantly. But they aided him in the consolidation of his power. And this is
I have a
Turner.
quote from Turner where he says big business support was virtually zero prior to the election.
Personally, I couldn't give a fuck. It's like if I was in Germany in 1933 and Hitler just became like Führer or whatever, I would have been like fucking sweet.
No,
It's better
I'm
than the
quoting from
alternative.
my own source where he says
Here's the
that
better
was
thing.
virtually
How do we
zero
explain-
support prior to the election of
But
33.
he
How do
says
we
big
explain that he
business
lost?
contributed significantly to the consolidation of Hitler's power in 33.
Well, if he says that, that contradicts the entire rest of the book.
Well,
because in his conclusion, he says it's
big
virtually
business
zero
was
prior
not.
to the election.
I'll quote.
Why can't you name some?
He
Like, I
said
can
they
name
aided him in the consolidation of his power,
citizen.
not its acquisition. So he's not saying that.
Okay, so when he comes to power, then they get on board. Yeah, of course. They didn't put him in power, though.
But to consolidate his power is the point.
Yeah, so he gets into power, and they're like, okay, we better support.
But you have to understand that Turner, which is
you got to pay the man. He's fucking
Turner
running the
is
show.
one of the historians, and there's other historians who disagree with him. He's one of the historians who are trying to come from the angle that big business was not responsible for the Nazis. That's his thesis. That's what he's working with. And even if we agree with that,
so your argument is just
what you said about big business not supporting him in the elections is just wrong.
No, what you said doesn't contradict it. It said that he had no support prior to the election, and then they helped him consolidate power. That's support after he got elected.
I agree.
I kind of want to move this topic.
Listen,
to like,
I agree. They didn't have major support before the election in 32, but by 33,
I
he
had
has
a good
the support.
Do you want me to quote again? Big business support was virtually zero prior to the election of 1933. That's from Turner in his conclusion.
Just ligma,
but after 1933, it changes.
When he's in power, the capitalists, when he's in power, they're like, shit, Hitler's in power, we better not.
They were instrumental in consolidating that power, is the point.
All right, now
they didn't want to get thrown in a concentration camp like he did to Tidson.
by the way, we're gonna take some.
No, because his power was not consolidated by then, so he wasn't even consolidated at that point. That's what you're not understanding here. They didn't have to help him consolidate.
This just blows out the theory.
He had a lot of dudes ready to throw people in jail and shoot people.
They could have worked to get rid of Hitler. And by the way, I'm just going off of your source. I'm not even going from sources that.
Okay, well, if you want to accept that source, you'll have to accept his conclusion that big business had virtually no role in the Nazis coming to power, and that's what I'm contesting. I'm not contesting that they supported them when they came to power. I'm saying the communist idea that this was somehow
he did not fully
This is so much more boring. Listen, man, here's a really interesting point. Do you want to hear an interesting point? Okay, this is like this argument of did they fund them at this point? Does this matter? Okay, all right. Do you know how? Okay, so all of the German intelligence staff.
Reality.
Yes, this is material historical. Intelligence agencies are the most important thing for a country. Okay, so how
are you going to do like the Anglo intelligence was secretly pulling the strings of everything?
It wasn't secret. That's where the term double agent comes from. Literally, why do you think that the British had all of Nazi communications throughout the entirety of the war decrypted the entire time?
So if they were controlling Germany, why did Germany go to war with Britain and start like bombing British cities?
The British actually fucked up super hard when they were trying to bomb London because the British had so infiltrated German intelligence that they fed them wrong answer. Like they told them that their missiles were landing in the wrong place. They had all of their sources telling them this. So they actually directed the V2 rockets to miss London from London the entire time.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, they had like good intelligence on Germany. It doesn't mean
so how did that? Why was that possible to happen in this state? Like why were the intelligence agents, not loyal to Hitler?
Hold on, I have a question for Keith. So, in the spring of 1932, Krupp and IG Farben bailed the Nazi Party out of bankruptcy. Is this true or no?
That's the first I've heard of it. I didn't encounter.
Well, your source said that in the spring of 1932, that industrial support or the support by big businesses was at a high, and then later in 32 it went down. So it would be consistent with what you quoted from your own source.
Yeah, but he also says only through gross distortion can big business be afforded a major role in the downfall.
Because that's his narrative. That's his specific narrative as a historian. He's not the only historian. It's not the only narrative. So let's just stick to the facts.
Well, there's another one. There's another book called "Who Financed Hitler" that has the same conclusion.
Okay, there's a lot of
Mao Zedong's dick was probably like 4 inches max.
You have to understand that ideologically speaking, it is in your interest to find sources that support your ideological position. So these are
that's like the authoritative book on this. He's like one of the most respected historians of the 20th century. I can give you "Who Financed Hitler" by Suzanne Poole either.
My question is, what is the fucking point of defending these loser regimes that fucking failed when there's actually like winning regimes that you see like some elements of things that you would want in? For instance,
China is winning because it's a fascist regime.
That's fascists lose. Fascists always lose. So how the fuck are they fascist? Or unless you're saying that they're going to lose because Joe Biden's calling them fascist.
Now, what is that?
You agree with our national security chief? Why? What's the point of that? Like, what are you accomplishing by defending fascism? What is the point? Like, they lost. It failed. It's not a,
Well,
it's not
like,
project.
Listen,
The
this
accomplishment-
this is
the
before
accomplishment is just like that. This distinction is pretty murky. Like it's not like as it's not a very hard and fast distinction. When you look at historical contingency, you can explain the differences between these regimes rather than looking at it through the lens of ideology.
So why
and the
don't you-
lens of
why
ideology, it's
Why
retarded.
did the German
Like, it prevents
intelligence?
you from looking at this
Why
clearly.
did the German intelligence services collaborate with the British?
So is there like some kind of like big structural reason for that? I mean, that seems like some kind of contingent historical kind of
No,
BS.
but why did they
like,
do it?
okay.
It's just contingent. I mean, that didn't happen in other cases. I mean, it didn't happen the other way around. The
What point are you
German
trying to
intelligence.
make?
No, I'm asking you what is your explanation for that?
I'm not really aware of like major collaboration between the intelligence
Oh, you aren't?
services.
Well, maybe you should
I know,
read about the British intelligence services at the time because it's actually extremely important.
Yeah, I know they were tracking a
way
lot
more
of German
important than knowing
communicators
anything
and
about
like they
Germany.
made great advances in like intercepting German communication. But
No, they
I mean,
flipped. They had great advances in human intelligence.
okay, so
because they
if
flipped
England was
the
directing Germany,
entire
why did
social-
Germany go to war with Britain in a war that bankrupted Britain and like ended the British Empire?
I mean, that's a really long, complicated question. We can talk about it in stages. Because
Yeah, I'm
it's
sure
like
you
fucking
got a
World War
super
II is
big
really
brain
complicated.
answer that would take forever to explain.
I mean, you should listen to some of the stuff we put out on the Sudcast because we go really deep into this shit because it's fucking really complicated. Like,
I don't know, man.
It's
I've
not
seen your
that
tweets.
simple.
I'm too transphobic for the Sudcast, unfortunately.
Whatever, guys. But I'm saying you actually can't explain your hermeneutic of this. Can't explain why the British intelligence agencies were able to flip all of these people in the German intelligence agencies, and the reason why is because a lot of the people in the German intelligence agencies came from that landed class, like old regime class, and a lot of them had really great relations because, again, like the hereditary aristocracy is not a national phenomenon; it's a global phenomenon. All of these people,
I think we're pretty fine with it. I mean, at least I am fine with acknowledging that Hitler was not like the greatest statesman of all time. He was no Caesar. He was no Stalin. You know what I mean?
You can put that lightly.
Yeah. He was like
sucked.
Yeah. He wasn't. He was a he was a good public speaker or whatever. He was a charismatic individual, but like he wasn't like a strategic genius like some of these other figures.
It was really like,
how do you
pretty much
explain the
all
connection?
fascists were really shitty at actually
How do you
governing states.
explain
They all
the
failed.
I think Hitler and Mussolini, like, they're kind of like there's some decent evidence, definitely with Mussolini, and some evidence with Hitler that they kind of started out as feds, and then they just like their psyop just was too successful, and then they were like, sweet, like let's just keep doing this, and like.
Yeah, and because their power never came from the people, they were immediately taken out by the people who put them into power in the first place. So that's why
Immediately, well, there was that war in between that cost like millions of lives.
I mean,
destroyed the British Empire. But,
what that was an
quite an
opportunity
elaborate
to
scheme.
redevelop.
That did not destroy the British Empire.
It did. I mean, the
destroy
British
the
Empire
British
was
Empire.
bankrupt by the war.
Yeah, but what destroyed the British Empire specifically was the triumph of the Soviet Union and the ability for the Soviet Union to help.
Yeah,
and
which is the
fund and
result of the
support.
war.
Yeah.
Supposedly
Yeah,
they
the
were
Soviet-
directed.
and
So
that's
they
because of
directed this whole
America.
thing to end up in a way that would
because
destroy
we-
the British
But,
Empire.
but you have to
Americans
understand,
helped
if
the
you have,
Soviet Union.
if you have a dialectic perspective, these are the ironies of history. That you can act on behalf of your own interests, and this can at the same time be the source of your very own demise of these same interests.
It's almost like when American fascists like go out to have like a rally in their own interests, and then what it does is it's like the worst scandal for them of all time, like in recent years, and it's totally destroyed
So like your
their whole
argument
attempt
is
to do
like
anything.
Britain directed the whole thing because there were a lot of spies that were like turncoats, and they orchestrated like the entirety of the war, and for Germany to go to war with Britain and like take loads of British lives and bankrupt
it's
the
not
British
that
Empire,
simple.
and have the Soviet Union wins, then that would destroy the British Empire. So
There's
It's
a
not
few
that simple
things
at
about
all
the
because
Soviet
America had
explanation,
better
yeah.
relations.
A few things about the Soviet Union throughout the course of the war. So by the time that it became clear, so the real position of the Allies when Germany invaded the Soviet Union was, let's just have hands off and see what's going to happen, because they were really betting that maybe Germany is going to eliminate the Soviet Union. They were completely fine with that. Now, when the Soviets proved that by their own
they were
initiative,
still at war with Germany.
yeah, but at the same time, they were conducting secret negotiations with the Germans about coming to a truce.
No, they turned down like 10 peace offers from Hitler.
But they were still
because
negotiating
actually that was a
with
British
the Nazis
intelligence
in
op.
secret.
They actually
and,
had people
they were
feeding
refusing
Hitler
to open up a second
that would
front,
be possible.
consistently. And then curiously, immediately in the aftermath of the war, You have the development of Operation Unthinkable, which was a plan that by 1956 or 57, I forget which date, they were actually going to engage in a preemptive nuclear strike, killing 80 million civilians in the Soviet Union, effectively accomplishing the Nazi
Churchill
plan of General
Churchill wanted to
Plan
drop
Ost.
nukes on Soviet Union right after the Second World War.
Yeah, so did Bertrand Russell.
Yeah, the Soviets wanted to nuke China, and Nixon said no. So
You know, I think, and, you know, it's like you have to be very careful about this idea that just because they are the allies, that means that they are serving each other's interests. Because, for example,
I don't believe that. I mean, of course, Britain and America and the Soviet Union. It's not like
it's like ISIS, right? Russia and America are both fighting. Although we know America funds them behind the scenes, but they're both fighting ISIS. But that
I'm not
mean they're
disagreeing
allies.
with this. I'm just like
it's a gamer moment.
The idea that Britain was like pulling the strings to destroy its empire for some greater. This is like
I think the
no.
point
America was the listen. Okay. So America and Britain were competing. The real war in World War II is between America and Britain. Frankly, it's like it sounds really counterintuitive, but when you get down to it, that's really what it was all about. Because they like. The other countries didn't have a fucking chance, man. Like it's not even close.
I don't know, man. I mean, the Germans are like 20 miles outside Moscow.
That makes sense. You know, I'll explain how this can be understood. Instead of thinking Britain as a monolith of an interest, you have to understand there's a struggle going on within Britain, which is between the kind of old ancien regime, the monarchy, and these kind of people, this old money kind of classes. And then you have, I guess, this new kind of national petty bourgeoisie and this new bourgeoisie within Britain. And the latter one, I think, is more aligned with America. The former one is secretly somehow connected to the Nazis. I don't know all the details of it, but there are really weird things. Like, for example,
royal family.
Have you seen the footage of the British royal family? The kids, they're doing the Hitler salute in the 30s, the middle of the 30s. It's
They're
like
all
they're a weird
Why did they turn down like multiple peace offers from Germany where they were going to like take their armies out of
because those the idea of an Anglo-German peace, as I said, was a specific plot of the British intelligence agencies because they wanted Hitler to not put as much effort into that side of the front, believing that there would be a possible offer.
Why did they turn
and
them
that's
all
when
down?
that's when they invaded. They turned them down because they set them up.
Germany's credibility as far as honoring treaties and peace treaties is concerned was thrown out the window in several instances. So they already appeased Hitler, by giving him Czechoslovakia. He went back on his treaties with them when he invaded Poland.
You've already said that Hitler was like no threat to Britain. Like it clearly wasn't in their national interest to like destroy their empire over.
No,
like,
they wanted to reconstruct the global economy. Right?
Yeah, there is really a contradiction here. The British Empire by this time is on its way out because of America. So you have reactionary classes within Britain who represent the reaction of the British Empire against this new development.
No, they could have maintained the empire longer without the Second World War
and the Nazis.
They could have maintained it longer without the Second World War. It bankrupted them. I mean,
Roosevelt
was sending a ship to take the last.
What I'm trying to say is that it was not in the interests of all of Britain to be this force of reaction in the face of this dissolving empire, this empire that is clearly on its way out, on the decline, this new US-led world order, which was based on, formally speaking, we know that's not the reality, kind of like national self-determination and sovereignty and the League of Nations and things like that. This was upsetting the former European colonial order. After World War I, the whole order was pretty much threatened. That's why, for example, the American response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia was one of such like shock and repulsion for that reason. The American-led global order and the American vision for world order was not like directly this form of colonization and this direct form of it represented the old way of things.
Which is why Churchill hated Stalin, whereas FDR and Stalin got along pretty swimmingly. So you can see a lot of like America actually supported the USSR and China at the time, right? Like we were over there helping, like this is why Mao has like such a positive view of America at the time. And this is like so counterintuitive to the way people understand the Cold War and shit like this later. But really, they were like Mao was like directly inspired by like George Washington. And I wanted to get to this from way long ago, but you said the three represents came from Mussolini, but that's false. It is origins are in Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address.
Yeah, I feel like we're getting a bit sidetracked with this stuff.
It's not sidetracked. This is a history that almost no one talks about or knows about because who's it useful for? It's not really that useful, but I find it personally very interesting because I do think that China, like, they've taken a lot from America, and in a lot of ways they resemble the old American order far more than our current order does.
Can I just ask, like, just back to China? I mean, this is like the basic question. Like, if China is moving more towards nationalism, more towards racialism, more towards having these various classes, more towards the market system, why should we believe that, like, eventually they're just going to, like, abolish the state?
No. I think this is the
communism.
There's
no
a few-
abolition of the state is a total
No, hold on.
mistranslation.
Communist society is a
wait. There is
stateless
something
society.
to
Do
clarify.
you disagree
here.
with that?
That's important. Is that
Like, Logo, you defend the state. Like, you're
hold on. Let's
with
talk about
anarchists on Twitter.
Communism isn't that isn't what
No,
that
I
means.
think it's important to talk about Chinese nationalism, and there's a crucial difference here. So, German and Italian nationalism, relevant to fascism, was based on the nation state, which was from the 19th century French Revolution and so on. That's where it came from. The Chinese nationalism, I don't know if you can call it nationalism in the same sense, because there is such a thing as Han nationalism within China. And Han nationalism is actually hostile to the Communist Party. Chinese nationalism is about the thousands of year old polity culminating in the Qing dynasty, which is multi-ethnic and, in the European sense of the word, multinational. It's multicultural and multilingual and multi-religious and so on and so on, but it's still a central unified civilization. So China is not a nation state, it's a civilization state. So when people are referring to Chinese nationalism, they're referring to the enthusiasm and the veneration and
Chinese
the honoring.
patriotism.
Yeah, it's more kind of patriotism.
I have
And
an
then-
academic paper. You can take this for whatever, but I mean, they studied this question. It's called Racial Nationalism and China's External Behavior. And it says the effort to build racial nationalism is deepening. In developing it, the regime has moved beyond
this is
state-centered
our-
patriotism to a racialized version of nation-centered patriotism.
I don't. What do you
This is
mean by
our
racial?
this is our propaganda.
They're
This is our
against Han
propaganda
nationalism.
because this
In China,
if
Han
you want to see
nationalism was a trend, and it was hostile to the Communist Party. And
this is the
I don't know what you mean by
avant-garde
race.
of defense of the American-led international order, which is using like Jay Sakai settler colonialist stuff to call. It's basically what you guys are doing in
No,
a sense.
the
You guys are saying,
opposition,
but it's
the
based-
opposition to the
but
American
it's-
order
but
is
it's-
nationalism.
You're actually
Like,
no,
it's
it's
the
not.
things
No,
that
it's not.
you as
No, it's
Marxists
not. No, it's
deconstruct,
not.
like
No,
faith,
it's
family,
not.
folk.
No, it's
That's
not.
like the
Nationalism's
opposition to
over.
neocolonialism.
The age of nationalism. The age of nationalism is over. There's no.
Listen,
there's
I'll
not going to be
concede that,
nationalism in that sense.
Amazon is like diversifying the workplace to reduce.
No.
strikes.
Here's how I would phrase things, right? I get what you're trying to say. There's clearly a dichotomy between American unipolar globalism and countries, nations, and civilizations attempting to go their own way and have some kind of self-determination and sovereignty. That is a very clear distinction, and I understand that. But you just have to be careful to understand that nationalism doesn't mean the same thing as it meant in the 19th century and in the 20s, relevant to fascism in Germany, because the
Well,
countries
according
that
to you, neither does Marxism or socialism or all these words. They all.
well, I don't know.
You gotta respect the dialectic, man.
Well, yeah, you really do, because there's nowhere in Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, according to which the reality of nations is not acknowledged. Or so the idea,
Yeah, but they're
is,
meant to dissipate for a global proletarian
no,
revolution.
not necessarily. No, I mean, that's not true. The whole point is that you can't make the nation an idol, because nations change. Now, granted, they don't change voluntarily. They change at a scale of hundreds or maybe
Yeah, but
thousands of
Marxism
years.
doesn't recognize that the nation state is an expression of this ethnic tribalism. It's an extension of family.
The nation state
Yeah, no.
is the result of modernity. It doesn't actually reflect the underlying, like, actual reality.
Yeah, but you can have
beyond.
like ethnic tribalism reflected in a nation state.
If you read Engels' work on the matter, because you're talking about tribes and stuff, Engels points out how the development of the state emerges from family, tribe, gens, and so on. So he traces that specific development, but it's not something you can't universalize tribes across the history of humanity. It's kind of nonsensical.
Yeah, but I mean, your project is like to dismantle these barriers.
No, absolutely not.
No.
Socialism in one country proves that Marxism was never. That's Trotsky.
But it's meant to be a temporary phase, isn't it? I mean, eventually you're
That's
meant to get the global proletarian revolution.
The
I mean,
idea
this was
is
Lenin's criticism of Sun Yat-sen. He said that this idea that you could have proper socialism by focusing on land reform and class collaboration and industrial production.
That was not the content of his
subjective
criticism.
socialists, he called it.
No,
which is just like what China's doing now. They're honoring Sun Yat-sen as like one of their
precursors. The meaning of
precursors.
Marxism in relation to different nations and civilizations is that through the imminent development of each nation and each civilization on its own terms and based on its own character, this is the basis of the universal humanity relevant to communism. Now, Trotskyism adopts the view that is inherited from liberalism and anarchism, and actually, more controversially, I will claim Trotskyism has a similarity with fascism in a sense, in its conception of universality. The Trotskyist view is a more top-down view of universalism, which does amount to liquidationism and the dissolution of nations and class coming at the expense of nations.
Which is why neocons are Trotskyites.
Yeah, as early as Marx, we see that the idea in Marx's critique of the Gothic program, the idea is that the content is the class struggle, but the form is national. So the idea for socialist realism under the Soviet Union and Stalin is that it's socialist in content, national.
Yeah, but it's ultimately meant to be like a temporary form. You know, eventually you're not meant to lose sight of the global aspect
No,
of global
there's
proletarian
no-
revolution.
there's no-
You're not meant to
You're thinking in
essentialize the state.
Trotskyite terms.
This is
No,
the
this
problem.
is like straight from Marx. I mean, Marx advocated
No, it's
free
not.
trade to like
Keith, the issue
dissipate these
with
nation states.
the issue with this idea is that it doesn't have a dialectical form. So this idea of like a universal global community that has no content. Like, what does that look like? What is its determinate quality? Right? It's a complete
Yeah, I agree. It's
abstract
bullshit, but
negation.
this is like this is the Marxist fantasy of
No,
like,
this is a
stateless
Trotskyist
platform.
fantasy of what Hegel would call bad infinity. It's undialectical and it has nothing to do with Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and so on.
It's understandable that you would take this to be the case because a lot of Western Marxists say this and shit, but Western Marxists are all Trotskyists.
Yeah,
And they're mostly
absolutely.
liberals. They're primarily liberals. They're
Yeah.
not fucking real. And
That-
they would
that's
call,
why,
they would,
for
they
example-
would actually agree with you. And they
Yeah.
would say, you're right, China is fascist. Like, you actually are closer in this sense. to
That's
their
why
way
I
of
say
viewing
things that when it comes to the real experience of Marxism, there has been a mistranslation to the West. And that in the West, my thesis is that to
Yeah,
understand
but it's a deviation from Marx.
what's the deviation?
The idea, you know, socialism in one country is
No,
kind of permanent
absolutely
form.
not.
It absolutely
No,
is.
The deviation from Marx was the Western Marxist.
I mean, he
thought.
advocated free trade for smaller nations, so like to accelerate, like
Marx
dissipating these differences.
Marx was a thinker of ironies, and he pointed out the irony of the fact that free trade, specifically in the case of India, would hasten the collapse of capitalism. So this is one of his ironies.
Yeah,
But
he advocated it in a lot of cases. For
but not in
smaller
every
nations.
case. In other cases, for
not
example,
in
when
an
it came to
absolute sense.
when
It's
it came to the
contextual.
decline of the free trade system, which was emerging because of people like Lincoln, it's very clear which side Marx took. That Lincoln's protectionism was more
Yeah,
historically
like he
advanced.
didn't advocate free trade for Ireland, for example, because he thought that they could industrially develop by separating from Britain. But again, like the end goal is that eventually you develop productive forces to such a capacity that, you know, the contradictions inherent in capitalism, that you're moving to a global proletarian revolution. I mean, this is like the first time I've ever heard this from Marx.
Just,
No, no,
Like,
that's just the
This
essence.
is-
It has no form.
so
There's
wait,
no-
how are
there's no-
nation states, like how are nations going to exist like in communism? Because, you know, that's going to
according
create
to
like
the development of their own imminent laws and reality. So class struggle is content, it's not form. It doesn't say anything about what the form is going to be.
how are you going to have a stateless society if nation states are still existing? Or, I mean, are you denying that like classless, stateless society is like, that's like the whole thing of communism?
The state, but you have to understand how the state dissolves and what that means. So the state dissolving doesn't mean like all distinctions and intelligible differences and differentiations disappear. It means that government no longer rules over the people at their expense, like as a kind of alien interest from the people. It just becomes the administration of things, and that people, as Marx put it, find their unity in the development of the scientific and aesthetic cultivation and sense. Well, basically the idea is that the things that unify people remain, but they become sublated in other common points of unity. Like, for example,
Why does every
This just
every
denies-
Marxist encounter like oppose? You don't call it nationalism if you're gonna like associate that with like romantic nationalism, but like oppose ethnic tribalism.
because ethnic tribalism, I guess, as far as I know what this means, is a invention of modernity. It's not something that
Tribalism is an invention of modernity.
no. I come from a tribalistic kind of my family comes from a tribalistic society.
Like,
but-
have you read the Old Testament? Like the Jews.
Yeah, I understand. I come from a tribalistic culture, so I understand. But it's not this idealized version of ethnic tribes and this eternal law. Like, tribes should be understood from maybe a sociological, psychoanalytic sense. They're a real thing, but like, for example, what
like the right of these people to have
I don't
their own
see
living
tribes in
space.
America. For example, I know tribes in Lebanon and so on, where my family comes from, so I understand tribes. But I live in America. I don't see tribes here. What tribes are you talking about?
Well, I mean, ethnic groups. It's like an extended.
They're not tribes. They may like in prison. They might stick together as a point, like unify with each other, but they don't function as tribes.
So basically, I mean, you think like ethnic nationalism is some kind of false consciousness developed by modernity? I mean, you know, like Irish nationalism, for example, goes back like literally thousands of years.
Ethnic nationalism, ethno-nationalism is inherently a result of liberal modernity. That's why in Russia,
in its current state, in its Westphalian state form.
Well, let me ask you a question. How come the ethno-nationalists in Russia are allied with the liberals?
I don't really see your point.
Well, because they represent the same form of the decaying Western modernity and the subjectivity proper to Western.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nationalists that are attached to, like, you know,
and Ukrainians
there's a lot of nationalists with like horrible ideas. You know, there's nationalists that claim to support capitalism, but
the point more primarily is that they allow
ethno-nationalism is liberal. It's inherently liberal.
Yeah.
Well, that's why
it's a liberal idea.
Tribalism. I mean, it predates like there's nothing more like human than tribalism. It predates liberalism.
There's nothing inherent to racial identity that forces it into like a particular ideology like this. I don't see how that makes sense.
For most of human history,
say for example, you have a country that is like ethnically homogenous, like say Japan, for example, or something. Now, if they were to have some kind of socialist reforms, or what have you, why would they all of a sudden stop being ethnically homogenous? Like that wouldn't make any fucking sense, right? So,
I mean, I don't know why they would. I don't know. I mean, like it's the
So they inherently liberal because they want to stay ethnically homogenous.
Yeah, but the reason why Japan is ethnically homogenous is because the Japanese people correspond to a specific civilization and a specific history. But if you look at how they came to be, you see that it's a mishmash between different groups and
ethnogenesis is a thing. Obviously, all ethnicities are produced somehow.
So I would say that in the future, like hundreds of years from now, races, or I don't know what you mean, people who look alike, I guess is what you mean, they would change according to the imminent laws governing the development.
No, race is there's a difference between ethnicity and race.
I just don't necessarily know what.
So what? I want to preserve ecological diversity. Like I want to preserve Irish people. Like why? Like why?
Some people are wildlife in this sense, and it's
no. Listen, I agree with you. There is something about Irish people that other people do not have. They have something other people don't. They have a unique character.
So like what is liberal?
There's also more of them here.
But that doesn't mean one has to be an ethno-nationalist. It just means you have to be true to the essence of what you are, and the essence of what you are is not.
Well, I mean, if your country is like getting flooded with like other groups Irish? That are like miscegenate and so on, well, like that kind of is, you know.
Are we allowed to say the N-word on Killstream?
So when it comes to the issue of immigration and so on, this is an issue of the sovereign state. So Ireland's part of the EU and it follows the EU's laws. It's not, it's as simple as that. But the thing is that immigration is probably going to be an inevitability in this unprecedented, interconnected world and so on. The choice is not between maintaining.
There's no reason why it has to be.
It doesn't have to be like you like. Why kind of if I just gave you the example of Japan.
No. Because I agree. Mass immigration has been a disaster in Europe. It's been a disaster. But I think the reason it's a disaster is not because of inherent ethno or racial realities. It's because there are clearly different cultural and civilizational qualities.
No, this is a pretty inherent
on part of both
seems to be a bit of a problem.
Groups. There's a clear civilizational and cultural difference.
Well, look,
under liberalism, this is what I'm just trying to say. Under liberalism, there is no acknowledgement of this difference. In liberalism, everyone is the same, and yet these differences persist. Under communism, it's always been the experience that even if differences can be acknowledged and some kind of authentic encounter and dialogue and exchange can be possible.
Okay, but even if these like cultural differences are a product of liberalism and it did dissipate or whatever, what if I still like want my group to continue? Okay, but what if I
liberalism does not acknowledge these differences? I'm not saying liberalism created them. I'm saying liberalism
Okay, yeah, I agree with that.
to acknowledge them. But another way of not
But
acknowledging
then why are you opposed, like, if we acknowledge these differences to like people choosing to
because this is the point of the kind of new Chinese view of bilateral and multilateral cooperation, win-win agreement, because you can at the same time acknowledge you are different, and then also on the basis of acknowledging this mutual understanding, we are different and we're not the same, you can still have a mutual contact and a mutual dialogue and a mutual exchange where you can you don't have to have a neurotic view that you must.
What if we don't want to? Can we acknowledge that we're different and like we're gonna live separately and like
only my family live in my house?
You
but
should,
like I can still be friends with other people.
No,
but they can't just move in.
Maybe through the course of this dialectic, this imminent development, and this is true for the history of all civilization, especially countries like China. Maybe it will happen that a fusion can happen, and that somehow
maybe
they
we
find
don't
a
want
common
that.
ground.
Maybe we don't want that. Why does that have to be like forced on people?
But at that point, when you don't even know what that would be like, though, because right now in liberalism,
okay, but I don't want to like risk it. I don't want to try it. Like I'm happy with like my tribe.
Well,
like,
that's why
what is
encounter
Ireland
other
right
people
now?
and we can like share recipes and
listen. Then you are just raising your background as an idol for its own sake, regardless of its content. Because
like you put your family before other people, and like
I agree with you. I agree with you. But here's the thing: you don't have incest, right? You have your family, and then.
But if I go to Ireland in like 30 years and like it's just full of like people that aren't Irish, but they have like a weird kind of pseudo-Irish accent, and they're like top of the morning to you, and I'm gonna be like, what the fuck is this? Like, why am I here? Like, it's not the same.
What did you say?
You won't get as many tourism dollars from you.
Hold on, this confusion.
No, it's not about that. There's a certain authenticity to what that
thing's
means.
more important than
this confusion and alienation or whatever is a result of liberalism, because liberalism does not acknowledge.
No, the fact that they're there is a result of liberalism. The fact that they're there in the first place is a result of this. Is just neo-colonialism, and you're like you're just scared to assert like ethnic nationalism, so you're just like trying to get around it.
It's not about that.
This is what I'm trying to say. At that point, you don't actually care about the essence or the content of what Irish people really are, because that content, as far as form is concerned, is undecided. Maybe through the development of this content, the form can change, right? But if you elevate
or maybe it'll be like destroyed through and like having these incompatible peoples that have to adopt this like plastic culture to make it work without violence.
You are just creating a mythology of the abstract Cartesian subject, of the liberal subject. You are betraying the
man. You're going to like extreme lengths to say that like people can't like choose to live together without like millions of migrants like coming.
Listen, here's the thing. This issue of immigration, again, I said the same thing. In liberalism, no differences are acknowledged. So there's a clear confusion that I'm used to a certain culture, I'm used to certain ways of living, and now I'm confronted with other people who have a very different way of living.
Okay, but do groups have a right to a living space? Like, do groups have a right to self-segregate?
Groups, what do you mean? Countries have a right to self-determination?
Groups, like ethnic groups. You know, like if the Irish want to live amongst Irish people and not encounter these people for whatever great reasons you're saying, I mean, like, are you okay with that?
To be fair, all the Irish groups, all our countries are.
I am not okay with creating a supranational body that's going to force certain policies on a certain country. So if a country pursues this path of development that it wants to be isolationist, like, what do you want me to say? Do you think I think America should intervene and attack them? No, of course not. But I can still from a distance, not forcing my view on them, say that I disagree with this path. That's
the beauty of self-determination, is they don't give a fuck what you think, because it's not you, it's not your country.
Okay, so in Ireland, what do you think if you were to run like a plebiscite right now regarding immigration? How would that go? Do you think that the majority of Irish people actually agree with you?
Well, the last time we had a vote on birthright citizenship, it was the most popular referendum ever. It was like 92% voted against birthright citizenship. And anytime there's polls taken on attitudes to immigration in Europe, it's massively against the policy. There's always a majority.
But I don't think European, but here's what my analysis. I don't think European people do this because they have some notion of ethnic purity. I just think they're shocked and confused because of this encounter with people who have a
but that's natural. Why do you want to like?
You have a bunch of like
let's
U.S. State Department
because
ABS being psyoped into their brains like 24/7.
The reason is because they live under a liberal system that does not afford them.
No, it's not. Like if a Somali, like if a group of Somalis live next to a group of Finnish people, like they're okay. Like it's not because of liberalism that there's like incompatibility.
Yeah,
like,
because in liberalism we are not allowed to acknowledge that we are different.
That's not it.
So like
that is precisely it.
We're not allowed to acknowledge we're different, but then what's the implication of that acknowledgement? The implication is maybe I don't want to live next door to. You know what I mean?
The acknowledgement is since we are different, and this is our baseline.
Let's have our own
some kind of common encounter, some kind of authentic encounter becomes possible because both are secure in their own.
Or what about like we all live in
authentic
our own
encounter
land,
can ligma. Just go back to Somalia.
Yeah,
you
we
know
can
what I mean?
encounter in people through like
this.
the internet.
This kind of racialist pathology is completely
pathology.
How is it pathology? How is it pathology?
Like normal, healthy human behavior.
Because it's self-defeating.
Perversion. It's a complete.
It's literally self-defeating.
Oh yeah, we gotta let all the Somalis in.
This is what the
Otherwise, we're feeding us. Oh my god.
Every civilization has been built based on an authentic, only in modernity.
On Somalis.
Only in
how many Somalis are in China?
You're literally like Vosh. Like, this is like
it's a fact.
Like,
in
when
modernity
it comes to race
alone,
and these questions,
only
you're
in
just scared and you just
Cartesian,
become Vosh. You're no
only
different
in
from
Cartesian modernity do we have people say we elevate the form of our culture for its own sake. We will never ever encounter anyone else. This is a result
because the Spartans were like, let's get some sub-Saharan Africans.
This is incestual pathology of modernity. Freud will describe this clearly as a form of incestual pathology.
Yeah, of course,
all
Freud will. Like, we know Freud's background.
All histories
What's
of
the most popular kind of porn in Ireland?
Is based on mutual encounter and mutual development between different peoples from different.
That doesn't mean we need to be forced to live together.
What do you mean forced to live together? You're not forced to live together now.
Yes, it is. Mass immigration is against the democratic will in pretty much every country.
Okay, so who's pushing mass immigration?
The ruling class, the capitalist elites.
Are they communists? Are they the communists?
No, I'm an anti-capitalist. They're capitalist elites. This is the new form of neocolonialism, where instead of settler colonialism, you take the old world into the new world for cheap labor. And,
exactly, because you're run by liberals.
Keith, I'll tell you, be careful.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
here's what I'd say.
I'm not disagreeing.
Wow.
Ireland.
Oh my god, we didn't know we were run by liberals. I was sitting here this whole time. My mind's blown right now.
Capitalists sent to Somalia.
Let's say Ireland becomes sovereign and leaves the EU, right? Let's just assume this would happen. Sovereign country, self-determination, leaves the EU. Now it's a democratic state. It's going to curb immigration. It's not going to have this mass immigration. Fine. But Ireland now cannot benefit from the exploitation of the countries that people are coming from. Remember, if there's no intervention in Syria...
I don't want this exploitative neo-colonial process.
Yeah, so Ireland has to somehow integrate itself in the world order, in the world economy. Otherwise, Ireland's not going to become autarkic.
Countries can have like an integrated world order without mass immigration.
Yeah, but you still
do you know that China has the lowest number of foreign-born population of any country in the world?
Listen, you are still
why aren't you advocating for
China
China to flood its country with Africans so that they can have this
if Ireland needs something from Africa, Ireland must address the countries of Africa and their specific developmental situation. And if that involves exchange of specialists from Ireland, teach Africans with their education how to teach them engineering and so on, and then Africans come to Ireland to take advantage of being able to send money back home for like they can be
refugees how to program jobs.
I am not advocating.
I feel like I'm talking to
I don't advocate for chaotic.
You don't want to endorse this thing that's like illiberal that's going to get you cancelled by leftists.
No, it's not.
I do not advocate for chaotic mass immigration. All I'm saying is that it is pathological to think that there must be preservation of a purity.
The most human expression.
No kind of.
Humans are tribal, like
it has nothing to do with tribes. Nothing.
I mean, that's what like
So,
the
like,
ethnos is. It's just
I was keen on.
It's not.
Mass immigration is not a communist policy. Mass immigration is not a
I
communist
know.
policy.
I'm not
It's a
arguing
liberal
with that. I'm not
policy.
like one
No
of
one-
these
I know.
anti-communists.
So, I
that
know.
thinks, like,
I
there's,
know.
like,
I know. I know.
secret, like
But listen,
Marxists that have,
I know.
like, directed
I know. I know.
everything.
I know. But I think it's important to note this, right? Because this wasn't a democratic thing, right? As you're saying, it's not something people adopted. This is something that has been forced down onto people in a lot of cases. But that isn't the result of like communists. Like this is the result of liberals.
I've
So if you
agreed
want
with
this to
you already
stop,
on that.
you have to fucking have a actual republic. But at the same time,
Yeah, you
the
have to
people holding
oppose
you back from that-
global
listen,
neo-colonial
the
capitalism.
people
with
holding you back
the
from
only
that
things
are
that really
not-
oppose neoliberalism, like
the
faith,
people
folk,
holding you
family.
back from that, the people holding you back from that are not the immigrants themselves. Those are not the
Yeah,
people who are
okay.
keeping you from changing these policies, right? So when you
Oh,
pathologize and but when you pathologize and you say, if we expelled them, if we expelled these immigrants, then suddenly everything would be fine, and then we would
Yeah,
be
that's
able
just a
to have
caricature.
national
Straw man,
self-determination.
like
Listen,
all the,
when
all
you
the usual
also
shit lib destiny
dehumanize,
arguments.
hold on. When you dehumanize immigrants and speak about them,
Not dehumanize, just go be human back in your
How
own
did I
country.
dehumanize them? Give me an example of me
because
dehumanizing
of this kind of language I'm hearing from Joel and so on, you
Okay,
don't have
that's
to
not for me. I
disrespect
haven't
others.
dehumanized
Why
them.
disrespect? Why not be human?
I haven't dehumanized them. I think that they would be better off in their countries of origin.
there's
as
no
well.
need to
So
I'm
if
sure
you-
they would say the same, man. They
Okay,
would
I'm
say
not
the fucking
disrespecting
same.
There's no need to disrespect. other people.
Why'd they come here then?
Because which immigrants
Why
are we
wouldn't
talking
they
about?
come? If
They want
you
cash.
if you
want free shit.
needed to, if
Yeah, and
you
their
had the
country's being
opportunity to
bombed.
help your family back
Gibbs.
home, would you do it?
Yeah, I don't blame the individual immigrants.
Yeah.
Joel,
I
aren't you in
agree. We
America
shouldn't-
now?
there's-
Well, you're
there should be
arguing
no
against the caricature.
dehumanization and no
Joel,
disrespect.
aren't you in America now? Like you're Australian. Why are you doing fucking in my country? Get the fuck out of here. What are you doing here?
That's not.
What? Okay. I'm like
Are
the
you?
same. I'm
Like,
the
you're
same
not an
ethnos
American?
as you.
Me and Joel are against.
I don't
like,
give a shit.
people taking a holiday.
You're not an American.
Okay,
You
well.
don't actually appreciate. You don't appreciate America.
Have you read the book?
I'm sorry. I thought this was
Joel,
American.
Joel,
I don't give a fuck about
have you
civic
read the book?
identity. What manner
Have
is
you
Now
it?
you're
read
the
the book?
liberal.
I recommend you a book. Read a book called Ethnos and Sociology by Alexander Dugin. He will make it very, very clear. Ethnos
Yeah,
has
Dugan is like on race.
Dugan is like
No,
if,
no, no.
if a Somali becomes Orthodox Christian, they're Russian.
Then
You
they're
know what I
Russian.
mean?
Yeah, fuck
Yes,
that. It's like,
this is what
Oh
happened.
yeah.
oh man,
Pushkin was African. Pushkin was an African.
Yeah, Pushkin was
descended from African slaves. African slave came to Russia, became Russian, and there are
And wrote the
aristocratic
best poetry.
lineages within Russia descending from this African guy, and they became
Gannibal.
Russified. And then also the Tatars and the Turks and all sorts, Mongols, all sorts of syncretism is what defines the modern Russian.
The best,
yeah, mixing
the best,
happens.
the
and
best
there's also
Soviet
like plenty
music
of
was from
ethnic groups that have
Koreans.
endured for thousands of years that have been quite happy, like with their own
No,
culture.
for thousands of years, it's only been a continual encounter between different
I don't
people.
know, man. Like the Pashtuns have been around a while. The Jews have been around a while.
All of those people are mixed in with others.
So like we should just like mix like the whole world together.
No, you
because
don't have to
they're,
go
like,
out of your way
mixing
to
in
do it.
groups.
But if
No.
it happens naturally, why oppose it?
But it's not natural. That's what I'm saying. If people like the natural
That's
state
like
is
saying
for people to be
that's like
tribal.
saying marrying someone not in your family isn't natural.
Just don't like saying that at all. That makes no sense.
You're the one that's
Fuck.
trying to force the unnatural thing. Like no,
No,
like
how am I forcing it? I'm not
because
forcing
without liberal propaganda, like Irish people.
This is
wouldn't
what you
want
don't
Somalis, like, in
understand.
Ireland.
Before liberalism, this was the norm. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, I don't know, man. I mean, doesn't the existence of like lots of ethnic groups show that like we've been becoming like more diversified in terms of like splitting off and
Yes, but this also corresponds to mutual encounter between different peoples. It's one and the same dialectic. It's not the diversification. And
Yeah, I mean, look at
unification
what is the
a
Irish
dialectic.
made up of? What is Irish made up of? Irish,
here we go.
you've got fucking people with Iberian heritage. You've got the old Norsemen that were in.
The thing is, like, ethnogenesis.
yeah, you're right. I
it
guess we
takes
should just let Africa in.
a million
like
times over hundreds of years.
ethnogenesis, like the way that it's being done now, there's no possibility of ethnogenesis. Like this is like that's
How
like a
do you know?
slow, organic process. Like if you look at America today, like that,
The Vikings were slow and organic.
you have
You guys are just defending this because you're scared. Like this is not a natural
No,
position.
scared of
This is-
what?
This is a modern neo-colonial capitalist position, and you're
No,
defending
I'm
it because
opposed
you're
to.
scared.
I'm
You don't wanna
opposed
get
to some of the
Absolutely
same
not.
things you
Of
are.
course it is.
The modern capitalist
problem-
position is one which conceives ethnos and nationality as pure forms, which have no
No.
dialectic.
No, all
This
that happens
is
is
a
like race
Cartesian
deconstruction.
This
Like
is
all
the
the stuff
subject
you're saying
of
about like, oh,
Descartes. This is
we're
an
all this mix
abstract
of different groups.
Cartesian
This is always
subject
coming
of
No,
from
it's
theory.
being specific. It's being specific because there is no white people. Like white people is not a distinct category.
you
It's
guys
not
are
real.
libertarians.
We're talking about ethnicity, and now you're talking about race. Like these are two
Listen,
different things.
liberalism.
What the fuck are you
Liberalism is
talking about?
precisely what requires the formal purity of the subject. You are the liberal.
Doesn't make any fucking sense.
I
Like,
guess
what do you
all
mean?
my ancestors for like thousands of years were like liberals because they had a sense
No,
of like
your
an extended
ancestors are
folk.
mixed with other people's.
The story of Irish nationalism and like Irish republicanism is a very old story, as you
you're
would know,
Irish.
but no, there
You're
wasn't.
Irish,
Yeah, it's like it wasn't
Irish
civic
identity.
nationalism.
Keith,
you know?
you're
They were
Irish,
fighting
right?
for a country.
It was
for
republicanism.
Irish.
Hold on, Keith.
Yeah, but
you're
Irish
The
people
Republicans were
themselves
fighting for a
are-
country
no,
for the
Keith,
Irish.
you're Irish.
Ireland
there's
for
a
the
high
Irish.
possibility.
Why
that
shouldn't
my
Connacht be
Quote from
independent?
Patrick Pearse.
Keith, since
can't
you're Irish,
Connacht be
you know there's a
independent?
high
All right.
possibility
One
my
at a time.
ancestors gave birth to yours, the Phoenicians. You know that's like a theory, right?
Okay, but like, what is like? I don't get like this. Isn't some like big BTFO? Like groups have mixed through history. Okay, like my
There's no
extended
purity.
group
There's
exists.
no. I'm not saying force anything. I'm just saying if it happens naturally, why be scared?
It's not happening naturally, and I'm saying people groups should have the right to resist it. But you're like just a priori against people.
No,
So, like,
no one
you go
should
out,
be
you go
forced.
out, and you meet a nice like Middle Eastern girl who's came to Ireland.
The Metabaddies.
Yeah, you're gonna stop that for your racial purity, really?
Yeah, I want my kids to look like me. What's wrong with that?
So you really like this girl,
that's
she's
a
great,
weird
etc. And then
aesthetic.
you're gonna turn her down because you're gonna say, I'm sorry, but I care about my race more than
Yeah,
Listen,
I want my kids to look like
let me,
me.
a genuine
be
connection
fair.
with
I want
someone.
my kids to look like me.
No, let me be fair, because I
More
like
than-
people from my background too, most of the time, right? But if I meet someone who's not from my background and still satisfies the essence of what I look for someone, then I'm not going to turn them down just because they're from a different background. But if I only turn them down just because they're a different background, I'm betraying the essence of what I am in the name of some idolatrous
Yeah,
form.
we all have
The
we all have
essence of
black
what I
friends,
am is I
bro.
want my kids to look like me.
you know what?
You're
Like,
not
I think
having
you can
kids in the
strip
first
that.
place.
Look!
You don't have-
I
Look at
prefer
your
my
Pats
kids.
logo.
I prefer my kids to look like me too. But here's the thing: I am also at the mercy of destiny, at fate. I'm not God. I can't say I know
sound a
what
lot like
I
the
am
Destiny
exactly.
dude.
I don't know exactly who I am and what I am. That's something suspended.
I mean, do you see the lens you're going to? Like, when me and Joel are just like, yeah, groups should be allowed to just like have their own like living spaces and like, you know, not have to deal with other groups. And like, you're going like to the lens of like,
Okay, so you don't want to take Northern Ireland back?
Because this is
You
the
think
issue.
they're fine?
This is the issue, right?
Why not leave Ulster? Why can't
That's
leave
exactly
Northern
the
Ireland
same as,
independent?
like,
of national
Somalians.
sovereignty and self-determination. I don't want anyone to be forced military to do anything, right? But I can still critique this position as from a human and moral so on perspective without forcing anything. I can still argue with it and say this is a false path. This is a false path.
all right, well, is it immoral if someone wants their children to look like them and just like chooses not to miscegenate?
Well,
If
I
it
think
occurs
from
on
a
its
cultural
own,
perspective,
I don't
if
care.
you want people to look like you, just fuck your siblings.
Yeah.
Terrible argument.
The optimal amount of like
Because
genetic drift
this is
is
why I
like
say
third
this.
cousin or something.
Because the essence of what you truly are is suspended in reality. You have no formal certainty over what that will look like. None.
I don't know. I can pretty much
I have a
choose where I
feeling
want to
if
stick
I
my
have a
dick.
kid
Where
with
I
a
want to
smile,
jizz.
The essence
like,
of
what they're
who
gonna-
you are
look
can
like
look
versus
like
if I have a kid
something
with a
you
white
didn't
person.
expect. That's what I'm trying to
Well,
say.
I know if I have a kid with a black person, my child is going to be less genetically similar to me than like some random Irish person I meet on the street.
So what?
So I want my
Well-
children to be genetically similar to me, like this.
This is a weird,
Why?
this is like a weird Bill Gates.
What's
like,
weird about it? This is like the
lab-
most
How's it
natural.
weird?
This is like the most natural
You
thing
sound
imaginable.
like a, you sound
People
like
have more
a,
compassion.
No one has a no one.
You
in
sound like
history-
a
People have
weird
more
guy in a
compassion,
lab.
No one
there's
was
more
like to say
empathy
that.
for
What do you
people that are
mean?
genetically similar
Listen,
to
man,
them. Like
your
genetic similarity
great-grandfather-
theory.
You're
Your
talking in the
great-grandfather
language
or
of
whatever
modern
was probably
science
cared more if
to
they were
describe
Catholic.
ancient and so on primordial realities. It's complete vulgarity. Genetic, what do you mean genetic? Genetic means what?
Listen, man, your great grandfather would have been like, yeah, I'll marry a Spanish Catholic girl, but no way would I marry a Protestant. Like, this
Yeah,
isn't how people thought in
absolutely.
history at all. My grandparents was
Absolutely.
big.
Pretty sure
was
Kate would
Irish.
marry a Spanish Catholic girl too. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
Protestant.
But so like, isn't that a non-genetic?
Yeah, white's
similarity?
all right, you know?
I don't know. It's so dumb.
Anyway.
It's so fucking stupid.
Listen, I
because
think
what you're really
people-
saying is like
people
you're like
are-
obsessed with like this eugenics notion that like your genes are superior to other genes, so you try to keep them pure. It's just stupid.
Well,
Not how anyone in your family has ever
Okay,
thought
so
through all
we
of
have
history.
been
It's very
going for
modern
like,
pathology.
well, we've been going for 2 hours and a half.
You want me to run in?
Wrap this up?
Let me.
'Cause I gotta- I
We
do
can
have
wrap
to-
it up. Let me run
Yeah,
in the
sure.
callers real quick, just on a
Yeah.
lightning round type deal, because they have been waiting a while. If that's okay with everybody.
this was a good
Yeah.
chat, by the way.
Yeah, and I just let it go. I completely, basically, just hands off.
I was,
There
I
was
was kind of hoping Haz would lose his shit, and I could see him and Joel go at it.
No.
No, Haz was like really well behaved. It was.
Alright.
I think it's because he respects us. Maybe there's like a.
Oh, that's kind
If
of
people
cute.
act human to me, I'll act human back. That's what I always say.
all right. Let's
No, like,
Well,
I
not
had-
human
I had fun.
neocons though.
all right. Let's run these guys in.
Neocons are human.
I was just hoping for like the shirt off, like alpha male contest. You know?
Mouse, go ahead. You're on the kill stream.
Oh, hey. I really liked the show a lot. I thought you guys talked about a lot of interesting things. I do have a few questions for Keith and Joel, though. It seems to me like most, at least at the beginning or in the middle of the debate, there's a big, the main point of contention was whether or not Hitler had rose to power because of the industrialist support. I mean, Keith pretty much, it seemed to me like he was ceding that Hitler was going out of his way, at the very least, to get the support of these people. And he's, in my opinion, ceded that, at least after Hitler rose to power, he had an ambiguous support from these industrialists. So how can he, like in good faith, say that the fascist position is somehow anti-capitalist when he, speaks about class collaboration in a positive way?
No, I don't think they went out of their way. They got little support and they turned leftward in 32 up to the 33 election. I mean, yeah, there's like the party existed for what, like 15 longer years before they got into power. Of course, they're going to like go looking for funding somewhere, but it was largely unsuccessful.
Yeah, but them being unsuccessful is not like, you see how that's not really.
Yeah, but the reason they were unsuccessful was
saying
because
these
they didn't like cook on policies and just become like pro-capitalist Republicans or something. They were unsuccessful because the industrialists could see that they're interested in the line.
So you think that and what about after they got in power? Do you think that they were just like leftist, basically? Is that like your point? Because that's what it sounds like.
But they subjugated capital to the interests of what they considered the social good. So they were socialists.
So you're saying you like are 100% sure that Hitler fundamentally was not like, he didn't cede any ground. You don't think that's true?
I think Hitler was making. I mean, maybe like you could criticize this move or that move, but he was playing the cards that he was dealt, and the cards that he was dealt were very different. He didn't come to power through some social revolution that like completely upended the entire class structure with this giant bureaucratic apparatus and the way that Mao come to power. You know what I mean? Like, he's in a very different situation, and that was my point from the very beginning, which was that I think you need to take into consideration these other material historical circumstances when analyzing these different states and understanding the states as these autonomous entities that exist in a complex structural strategic environment. And Marxism is not like junk to me. Like, there's interesting insights in Marx and in the Marxist tradition, but I think you need to add some extra elements in there to really like beef up your analysis to be able to make sense of these things. And when you do, you can kind of see there's a lot in common between the National Socialists, the Fascists, and some of these communist states in terms of some of the goals that they had and what they were dealing with. But they were coming at it from very different angles. They had very different ways of coming to power, different strategic situations, etc. And so when you take those into consideration, I think ultimately, if Mussolini or Hitler could have cucked the capitalists, like if they didn't go to war and everything fell apart and they had some time to like develop the party, and I think they would have headed in that direction, where it would have ended up looking more and more like similar to not necessarily how China is today or something, but it would have looked more and more like this kind of bureaucracy that basically subordinated capital entirely to the state.
I mean, Hitler said to generals in the Wolfslayer in 1944 that he wanted to establish racial unity in Germany by overcoming the capitalist order and working for the construction of a new classless society. That's a quote.
Yeah, I mean, he did. Like, you look at sort of like the reforms to the economic system under both Mussolini and Hitler, and you can see they're heading in that direction. They're heading in a socialist direction.
Yeah,
from
they're starting from a
shit
different
was
place
before they came to power. No one can argue against that, and so you know, it's like you got to respect process. You can't expect people to just when you come to power, you can't just like arbitrarily just do whatever the fuck you want. Like, that's not how shit works in reality. And that's why that's why I don't come here to say like fuck Stalin, fuck Lenin, fuck Mao. I actually respect all these figures because I understand they were making decisions that made sense based upon the situations that they were in. And so this debate was not so much we're team fascist, you're team communist, and we're arguing about our guys are better than your guys. But it was more nuanced than that, at least for me. I wanted to argue instead to kind of get outside of these ideological teams and develop like a more nuanced analysis of this stuff. And I think Marxists have a tendency to be very uncharitable towards fascists. And I think part of the reason why they do that is probably just like smart, because they don't want to associate with fascists because they have such a bad reputation. You know, it is what it is. But I think it's productive discourse to have because, you know, looking at these states, I think tells us a lot about, I mean, that's how you really understand the 20th century, really. And also it's like the situation that we're in now in the West, like in the Anglosphere in particular, like we need to look to these states as models for like some signs of how the fuck we progress, because clearly, you know, this kind of gay liberal BS like sucks. So these, like you can at least, I mean, we're not going to copy out and the lesson that you should take is you can't copy and paste from any of these other states. You have to respect your particular circumstances.
All right, I see a super chat here. First Worldism says, what's even the disagreement in essence? He kind of talked about this a minute ago, Joel did, though. Reds, browns versus dark reds. Neither respect people's liberties and principle of private property. China's a competent state, quote, at abusing people, and Western government now follow their example. Sad.
Your audience is full of liberals, Ralph.
Let's see. Epstein Denton said, rescued from the AF high school gang bullying early, and Ralph Hamel, let's fucking go. That's right. We did start a little early tonight. Neon Noir says, as you are, well, I won't say what he said, but he insulted your physiognomy there. And then he said, you sit on Twitch collecting shekels all day. You're a communist through and through, he said. Okay. BD says, has stopped coping with the ML crap. Join us. Shout out to New Frontier. Hail Keith. Hail Joel. Hail Victory. Let's see. Prolific something or another. I won't repeat.
Do you guys not feel how cringy and LARPy this is?
Yeah,
like,
it's a joke, man. Just like have a laugh.
It's not a joke, though.
I seen tweets from you from like 3 years ago where you go on about how great National Socialism is, dude. So like,
Ralph,
I think that was only a year or two old.
Come on, Ralph. I hate to do, but like, I really do. I have a show I gotta be going on soon, but so like,
it's cool. All right, just let me run through. I've got most of those. Danny says, if you can see this comment, wink at the camera. Okay, there you go. And then there's a couple more that I won't read. Josh Neal, real quick. Let me go through callers just real quick. There's only two more after this. Go ahead, get your point in real quick. If you can hear me. Josh Neal. Mr. Neal. Oh, silent Josh Neal, silent partner in tonight's episode. I appreciate you listening, though. All right, now let's try another one. Big Daddy Matt, go ahead.
Hey, what's up, guys?
What's up, man? Go ahead, lightning round. Go.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to say that watching this, watching Keith and Joel destroy these two losers was like watching an epic IRA bombing compilation.
Oh, no, God.
You know?
All right.
I'm telling you, you don't feel like the cringe LARPiness of this? Like, you seriously find this like really compelling and authentic?
All right.
I don't know. It seems
that?
like
Just
obvious.
like that
Took the L.
I don't feel that way. Do you feel that way? I feel like we had a pretty good conversation.
Big fat L.
Really?
Yeah. Has it okay?
Do you believe that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which one's talking right
don't
now?
sound
Are
very
you
confident.
Logo?
let's just let the audience decide.
All right, Big Daddy Matt, thank you, sir. I appreciate you getting that in.
Thanks, Ross.
All right, good. What in the world? All right, Hollywood lightning round, go.
I just wanted to give a shout out to Keith. And I know that you always talk about how you win debates. I just wanted to know, do you think you won this debate as well? Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think on the substantive points, I do feel confident that I got my points across, and yeah. So yeah.
Frastus Theo, go ahead, last caller. Well, I'll probably do a little bit of kill stream after this. Last caller for these guys. Go ahead. Oh, he's another silent guy. All right, you know what? I'll try Josh Neal. Josh Neal, did you get it fixed real quick? Uh-oh, I heard something. But it wasn't your voice. That's the unfortunate part. All right. Sayonara, sorry. Thank you, Keith Woods. Thank you, Joel Davis. Thank you, Haz, as well. Thank you, Logo Daedalus. Do you guys got anything else you want to say here at the end?
No, I had fun. It was cool to talk to Haz for the first time. And Logo was here as well.
All right.
Yeah, overall, I think it was a productive discussion. Thankfully, it didn't get ugly, which is nice. Yeah, I enjoyed myself. I had a good time. So, yeah.
Well, I had a good time as well, and I want to thank all you gentlemen for coming on, and I appreciate you coming on the kill stream. Hope to have you back, and stay safe this weekend. It's upcoming weekend.
Okay, for sure. All right, see you later.
All right, peace out, guys.
Bye.